At my wife's funeral, my daughter handed me a moving box, so I handed her the deed. We buried my Helen on a Tuesday. It was one of those clean cold mornings you get in early spring, the kind where the light comes down thin and honest through the trees at the cemetery, and the pastor said the words I've heard him say over half a dozen coffins in the 50 years at that church, and I stood beside the hole in the ground and held onto my daughter's arm because my knees were not entirely mine that day. And when they lowered my wife of 51 years into the earth, I felt something come loose in my chest that I don't have any better word for than a nail giving in a joint I'd trusted my whole life. That's the closest I can get. Something that had been holding me up for a very long time gave way, and I stood there in a black suit at 74 years old, and I let it. We came back to the house after. Helen would have wanted people fed, so there were people fed. My daughter Rebecca had set the whole thing up with a caterer, capable and busy, moving through my kitchen like it was hers, directing where the flowers went and where the coffee urn went and where the little plates of sandwiches went. And her husband Trevor circulated with a hand on people's backs and a soft voice, doing the son-in-law thing at other people's expense. Helen's friends from the library came, and the neighbors from up and down our street, and a couple of my old crew from the shop I retired out of, and my cousin Mary, and Helen's book club, and the pastor's wife. People stayed a couple of hours. I sat in Helen's chair by the front window and let them come to me one at a time and hug me and tell me things about my wife I already knew, and I nodded and said, "Thank you," and looked past them at the little garden Helen had turned over herself last October, when she still had the strength for it, and by the time the light was going, the house had emptied out until there was just Rebecca and Trevor and me. I want you to hold that picture a moment, the three of us. A caterer's boxes on the counter in the kitchen, half a coffee urn left, Helen's flowers on every surface, more than we had vases for, the chair Helen used to sit in every night with her book, now with me in it because I could not, that afternoon, sit in my own. And out the window, the light coming lower and lower over the little maple tree Helen and I planted 42 years ago that spread now all the way to the neighbor's fence. 51 years of a marriage poured into a house that had held every day of it. That was what was in the room when Rebecca walked in from the kitchen with something under her arm. She had a flattened cardboard box, one of those big moving truck boxes, folded flat. She was carrying it the way you carry a folder into a meeting, casual, official. "Daddy," she said, in her most reasonable voice, the one she uses when she's decided something and is about to tell you. "Trevor and I have been talking, and we wanted to say something to you today while we're all here together. We think this house is too big for one old man now. We really do. I know it's fast, but sometimes it's better fast. You don't want to be here alone tonight in this big empty house without Mom. We can start packing tonight. We've talked to a real nice place, Willowbrook. Remember, we drove past it last summer. Trevor and I looked at rooms there for you, and there's a lovely one open. It's a mercy to do it all at once, Daddy. It really is. So we brought this in from the car." And she held out the flattened moving box to me, across the front room. In the last hour of the day I had buried my wife. I don't know if you know what a carpenter does when he sees a piece of work that's out of square. Because it isn't what you'd guess. He doesn't shout at it. He doesn't get angry at the wood. He doesn't accuse the boy who cut it wrong. He puts his tool down, and he steps back, and he looks at the whole piece for a long moment, and he reads the grain, and he reads the cut, and he reads what happened to make the thing come out crooked, and then he decides what to do about it. That is what 52 years of carpentry teaches a man to do in front of something wrong. You do not react to a bad joint. You read it. So I sat there in Helen's chair with my hands in my lap, and I read my daughter. I read her from across 60 years of watching her face. She was my little girl once, standing on the workshop step, waiting for me to come home. And I read her from across 60 years of reading wood grain, and knowing when a piece has been prepared a long time before you see it. And what I read on her face, plain as a growth ring on a slab of oak, was that she had not decided this that afternoon. She had not decided it that week. She had decided it a long time ago, and she had planned this exact moment. The moving box in her hand, the reasonable voice, the mention of the facility, the "let's do it all at once, Daddy," for the softest possible hour of my life. She had waited for the hour she thought I would be too broken to argue. That was what her face told me, in about 2 seconds, across my own living room, with my wife's flowers still standing on every surface. I did not argue. That was the second thing carpentry taught me. You do not argue with a bad joint. You do not stand there explaining to a piece of wood that it ought to have been cut differently. You go to the drawing, you go to the plan, you go back to the print, and you show the boy where the mistake was, in the paper, so he can see it for himself. That is the only way people ever really learn a thing. I said, Rebecca, come with me to my study, sweetheart. There's something you should read. I got up out of Helen's chair, slow, because my knees were still not entirely mine, and I walked back through the house to the little study at the end of the hall. I built that study room 41 years ago, with my own two hands, knocked out a wall to a spare bedroom, paneled it in oak. I milled myself, put up the bookshelves that took Helen's paperbacks and my carpentry manuals side by side for 4 decades, laid the floorboard by board across 2 long weekends when Helen brought me sandwiches, and in the middle of it stood the desk. I built the desk the year I married Helen, a plain solid oak partner's desk with hand-cut dovetails at every corner, joints that don't need glue to hold, and it has stood in that room ever since. I opened the top drawer of that desk. I took out a leather folder, and I took out of the folder the deed to this house, the paper Helen and I signed the day we bought it, 40 years ago, that May. Rebecca was in the doorway of my study with Trevor behind her, watching me, her face gone a little careful. She had expected me to argue. She had not expected me to walk to my study. I handed the deed to my daughter. Read it out loud, honey, I said. Every word, all the way through. Take your time. There's no rush. She looked at me for a second, wary, and then she took the deed, because refusing to read a piece of paper in front of your grieving father is a hard thing to do, even for Rebecca, and she started reading it aloud. The property description, the legal boilerplate, the names of the neighboring lots, and the meets and bounds, and all the plain workaday language of what a deed actually is when you take it out of a drawer. Trevor's face began to change halfway through, because Trevor is in real estate and knew what she was reading, and he could see the shape of the paper coming before Rebecca could. She kept going, and then she came to the line I had wanted her to come to, and she read it, and her voice slowed down about a quarter of the way through it, and then she stopped altogether. She had read, Sole owner, Edward Whitaker, holding said title in trust as established the 5th day of May, 1984. Sole owner, Edward Whitaker, in trust. Not our names, not Edward and Helen Whitaker, not the Whitakers as joint tenants, not any of the things Rebecca had grown up assuming were on that paper. Just me, only me. Held in a trust set up 40 years ago that only I control, with a lawyer of Helen's own choosing on the day we bought the house, because Helen, my quiet, stubborn, school-teacher-wise librarian who read everything and forgot nothing, Helen had insisted the day we closed that this house be held in my name alone, in a trust she'd had her lawyer draft, because Helen had seen something 40 years ago that neither Rebecca nor Trevor had ever thought to look for. And she had made me promise at a kitchen table in a rented apartment 40 years ago to keep it that way. And I had kept that promise for 4 decades, and until my daughter walked into my study behind me holding a flattened moving cardboard box on the afternoon we buried her mother, I had never once understood, all the way down, why my wife had asked me to. I looked at my daughter. I did not raise my voice, because I have not raised my voice at any of my children in the 52 years I have been a father, and I was not going to start on the afternoon I buried their mother. I said, quiet, that's your mother's doing, Rebecca. Every letter of that. She insisted, the year we bought this house, before you were born, before your brother was born. She made me hold the deed in my name only, and she picked the lawyer, and she picked the trust. I have kept my name on that paper for 40 years. So the house is not too big for one old man now, sweetheart, because it isn't one old man's house to give up. It's mine only. It was mine only the day I signed it, and it was mine only every day of your childhood, and it was mine only today when we buried your mother, and your mother made it so. I paused, and I looked at her, and I looked at Trevor in the doorway behind her. Take your moving box back to your car, honey. Take Trevor, go home. Tomorrow or next week, we can talk about anything you want to talk about. Tonight, I am going to sit in this study, in a chair I built with my own 2 hands. In a room I paneled with wood I milled myself, and I am going to grieve my wife in the house she and I lived our whole life in. That is what the widower of Helen Whitaker is going to do tonight. And you are going home. They went. Trevor took the flattened moving box out of Rebecca's hand and folded it under his arm and did not look at me, and Rebecca said, in a voice that was trying to be the reasonable one and coming out thinner than she wanted, Daddy, we were just trying to help. And I said, gentle, I know, sweetheart. Go on. And they went out of my study and down the hall and out my front door, and I heard their car doors, and I heard the engine, and I heard my daughter drive away from the house on the day we buried her mother, with a flattened moving cardboard box on the back seat of a car she was leaving in. I sat down at the desk I built for Helen the year we were married. I put the deed back in the leather folder and the folder back in the drawer. I put my hands flat on the oak I planed by hand 52 years ago, and I looked at them a long time. They are old hands now, but they still know what they made, and they still know a bad joint when they see one. And I understood, sitting in that chair, that the moving box had not been grief clumsiness. My daughter had not brought a flattened cardboard box into my living room on the afternoon we buried her mother by accident. She had brought it because it had been decided in her house with her husband weeks ago, perhaps months ago, that the softest hour of my life was going to be the hour they took my house. And what I had just seen when I opened that drawer was the first thin edge of something much bigger, something that had been rolling toward me for a long time from a place I had not been looking, and I could feel it, the way an old carpenter can feel a beam that has begun to go somewhere in a house even when he can't yet see the crack. There was more to find, and I was going to find it. Not tonight. Tonight I was going to grieve my wife, but tomorrow, with steady hands, I was going to open every drawer in this house and every account we owned, and I was going to find the whole shape of what my daughter and her husband had built, while I was too busy watching my Helen die to look. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking, and it went so far past a moving cardboard box, it took my breath when I saw the whole of it, all the way to a house that had been quietly listed for sale 2 weeks before my wife's death, and a room at a facility with a deposit paid the very week she got her diagnosis. Let me ask you one thing. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and how old you are, because I've got a feeling some of you have been handed a version of that flattened box on a day when you were softer than you'd ever been in your whole life. If you've ever felt somebody in your family time, their move for the hour they thought you'd be too broken to say no, do an old carpenter a kindness and hit that like button and subscribe and stay with me to the end. Because this is the story of the day my daughter handed me a moving box the afternoon we buried her mother, and the story of the deed I handed her to read out loud in reply. And it is the story of what my Helen had put in an envelope with our daughter's name on it a year before she died, that Rebecca did not know existed, and that would, in due time, be read out loud in front of her, in the same steady voice, in a room she could not walk out of. Stay till the end is where she found out. Let me tell you what kind of story this is, so you know what you're settling in for. There's no shouting in it. 52 years working with wood breaks you of shouting, or the wood breaks you. You cannot holler a mortise into being square. You cannot curse a bad piece of oak into being a good one. You cannot rush a joint. You go slow, and you check the drawing, and you check the grain, and you take a little bit off, and you check again. And if the piece is wrong, you find out why the piece is wrong before you try to fix it. Because a repair made on top of a mistake you haven't understood is worse than no repair at all. That is the whole trade in one sentence, and it turned out to be the whole way to face what my daughter had built too. I did not shout at Rebecca. I did not fight her, not in the ordinary way people fight in families. I did the slow, patient, careful thing a good carpenter does when a piece has come out crooked. I read the whole piece from end to end before I made one cut in reply. And by the time I was finished, every joint of the truth was tight, and every joint of the story my daughter and Trevor had told was loose, and there was no way for them to stand it up anymore. And I want to say one more thing before we go back, so nobody comes to this looking for the wrong thing. This isn't a revenge story. I know the title makes it sound like one, and I understand why, and there is some of that feeling in it, I won't lie. But revenge was never what I was after. What I was after was my life, my house, my name on the paper my Helen had made me keep it on, my son whom I had lost to years of pride and lies, my granddaughter who had a real chance to come up with a trade in her hands if I could just protect her from the rot on her aunt's side of the family, and above all, my Helen's honor. Because the day I let anyone say in public that the house Helen and I built our whole life inside was too big for one. Old man was the day I let my wife's memory be moved out with the coffee urn. I wanted to repair what could be repaired and protect what could be protected, and let the truth do the rest. Because the truth, if you have the patience to let it come out from under a pile of nice words, comes out on its own. and no story built on lies will hold when a real drawing is finally put down on the table. So, when you hear how this ends, don't hear it as an old father getting even with his girl. Hear it as an old carpenter reading the grain and making one clean cut and letting his daughter reap exactly what she planted the afternoon she chose to hand her father a flattened box. But to understand how Rebecca thought she could try what she tried on the day she tried it, you have to understand about Helen and about the year she spent dying and about what it does to a man to watch that. The house was too quiet without her. 51 years of marriage, and Helen filled every hour of it with sound. Her voice, her radio, the pages of her books turning in every chair in this place, her humming when she cooked, her calling to me from 3 rooms away with a piece of something she'd just read that I had to hear. When she was gone, the house went quiet in a way I have not, in the year and change since, learned to be in. I moved through the rooms in the first days the way a man moves through a workshop after the machines have all been sold, out of habit, through a space that had stopped making the sounds it always made. We got the diagnosis on a Thursday in a little consultation room down at the medical center. Pancreatic. Advanced. There wasn't going to be much time, they said, and there wasn't. About 8 months in the end, and it was not gentle, and when it was over, 51 years of a marriage was over with it. And I was 74 years old and alone in a house full of a woman who wasn't there anymore. Grief does something to a man that people who have not been through it can't picture. I'd reach across the bed for her before I was even awake and find it cold and lose her again. Whole, every morning, the first thing. I set out her coffee mug alongside mine for months before my hands learned better. Her handwriting is on the calendar in the kitchen through the end of a year she did not live to see, in her steady schoolteacher librarian hand. And I have never taken that calendar down. Her reading glasses are still on the little table by her chair by the front window. I have never moved them. And for the 8 months of the dying and the weeks after, my family watched me move slower, watched me forget the little things because my heart was full of the big one, and one of them, at least, did the arithmetic. Rebecca looked at her father, moving through the world at half speed, with his wife dying by inches, and where a decent daughter would have seen a heart being broken, she saw a leverage she could use. And here's what she never understood, because she has never in her life loved anybody the way I loved her mother. Grief that deep does not make a man simple. Sometimes it's the very thing that finally sharpens him, once the first storm blows through. And there is a harder truth she never once factored in. A man who has already lost the one person he could not live without has run clean out of fear. There is nothing left they can threaten him with. The worst thing that could ever happen to me had already happened, on a Thursday in a bright little room down at the medical center, and everything after that was just weather. My daughter looked at me and saw a soft old widower she could catch off balance with a moving box. She was looking at the one man in that county with nothing left to lose. I'll give you one night so you know the man they thought they were dealing with. It was maybe 6 weeks after Helen died, and I woke around 3 in the morning, the way I did every night then, reaching across the bed for her before I was even awake, finding it cold, losing her again, whole, the first thing. And I could not get back to sleep, so I got up and went downstairs in my socks, and I stood at the kitchen sink in the dark, looking out the back window at the little garden Helen had turned under the October before she got the diagnosis. The garden that would not be planted this spring for the first year in 40. And I understood, standing at that sink at 3 in the morning, that there was nobody left in the world who needed me to come back up to bed. 51 years, there had always been somebody who needed me to come back up. And I stood in a kitchen full of a woman who was not there, in a house I had built with my own 2 hands, and I said out loud, to the dark and to the little garden and to whoever was listening, Helen, I don't know how to be here without you, sweetheart. I don't know how to do this on my own. That was the man my daughter looked at 6 weeks later and saw a plan she could run. A widower at his own kitchen sink at 3 in the morning. And I understand, in a cold, clean way, why she thought it would work. A man that hollowed out looks finished. What Rebecca never understood, because she has never in her life loved anybody the way I loved her mother, is that a man who has already lost the one thing he could not bear to lose has run clean out of fear. You cannot frighten a man past the worst thing, once the worst thing has already happened to him, on a Tuesday afternoon in a bedroom looking down at his wife. Let me tell you about the trade, and about Helen, and about this house, because you can't understand what my daughter tried to hand me a box for unless you understand what the box was meant to carry out. I went to work with a carpenter at 15 years old, and I retired at 72, and everything in between was the same work by different names. I built houses back at the beginning, framing and finishing them alongside a couple of men who taught me the trade the way you can only learn it, standing next to somebody older who's watching your first cut. Then, for most of my working life, I did custom work. Cabinets, built-ins, kitchens, staircases. The interior joinery of houses better people than me had gotten to design. I worked wood by hand for longer than a man is supposed to be allowed to do anything, and I loved the work in a way I do not know how to describe to a person who has not had it. Because working wood is a conversation with a thing that talks back. Wood remembers. Wood has grain, and the grain runs the way it grew, and if you cut across the grain wrong, the piece will split, and if you cut with the grain right, the piece will hold for 200 years. You cannot lie to wood. You cannot bluff a piece of oak. It will tell you plainly and immediately what you have done to it, and it will tell your grandchildren what you did to it too, because wood remembers what you did to it. 52 years of that work teaches you humility, because the material does not care what you meant to do. It only knows what you actually did, and it teaches you to read the grain before you cut. That is the whole trade. Read the grain. Trust what the piece is telling you. Do not force it against itself. Cut once cleanly with the wood, and the joint will hold as long as the house stands. I met Helen the year I turned 20. She was one grade behind me at the community college where I was taking a drafting class at night, and she was studying to be a librarian, which she became, and which she was for 38 years at the library up on the hill until she retired. And Helen was, I'm going to try to say it right, and I won't, because there are no words for the person you married when you were young and lost when you were old. Helen was the person who could see what a room, or a person, or a family, or a country really was, underneath what it was pretending to be. She read everything. She listened more than she talked, and when she talked, it was because she had put a thing together in her head that nobody else at the table had noticed yet. She kept every scrap of paper in our life in an order that I still don't understand, and I have been trying to keep it up since she died. She raised our 2 children with a firmness so gentle they only figured out later that they had been raised at all. And when we married, she brought into our marriage a father. Her father, a plain small-town lawyer I only met a handful of times before he passed, who gave us, as a wedding gift, 1 hour of good legal advice. And Helen listened, and Helen carried what she heard from that hour with her the whole rest of our life. We bought this house 4 years into the marriage. It was not the house we were supposed to be able to afford. It was a small old bungalow on a good street in bad shape, and I looked at it and saw exactly what my hands could do to it over the next 20 years. And Helen looked at me looking at it and said, Ed, if you can see it, we can do it. And we bought it, and I did do it over the next 20 years, one weekend and one evening at a time. I put in the kitchen. I built every cabinet in this house, every bookshelf. I took out the wall between the front room and the dining room. I paneled the study I sit in now. I laid the hardwood upstairs. I put in the porch. I built the workbench in the basement. That is still where I go to work. I built the back deck twice. I built Helen a little writing desk in the corner of our bedroom, and it's still there. There is not a square foot of this house that has not had my hand on it. Every year I made this house more of ours, board by board, and Helen watched and made coffee and read to me at night while I worked at the kitchen table on the drawings for what I'd do the following weekend. 50 years of that. 50 years of a house made not with money, but with weekends, one weekend at a time, in a marriage of 51 years, and the house holding it all. Every birthday, every Christmas, every argument we ever made up from, every dinner, every cold, every fever, every homework night, every prom picture on the porch, every anniversary card on the fridge, both children's first steps, my Helen's last breath, held it all in its rooms because it was built to. That is what Rebecca was pointing a flattened cardboard box at the afternoon she buried her mother. That is what she meant when she said, "Too big for one old man." A number in Trevor's realtor's head is what she meant. A comp on a spreadsheet. A lot value in a neighborhood that had turned over around us into money. She looked at 50 years of my hands on this wood, and 51 years of a marriage lived inside it. And she saw a tear down. Hold on to that. It is the whole story of my daughter, and it is the whole story of my son-in-law, and it is the whole reason a flattened box came into my living room the day I buried my wife. And it was Helen being Helen, who years ago did the one thing that ended up saving everything I had. But I want to come back to that in a moment, because it deserves its own telling, and because it's the whole reason my daughter's plan was doomed from the first flat box she ever brought into this house. Before I show you the shape of the plan, though, you have to meet my children. Helen and I had 2 children, and I love them both the way you love your own, completely, and without ever quite seeing them clear. One of them is the reason there was a moving box in my living room the afternoon of my wife's funeral. The other is the reason I can tell you how it ended. The older one is Rebecca, my daughter, and I'll be fair to her because I'm her father, and I had a hand in making her what she became. Rebecca was always the one who wanted the picture of a life more than she wanted the doing of it. Even as a girl, she wanted the party, the outfit, the wedding, the house that would look right in photographs. Helen worried about it early. I remember an evening when Rebecca was maybe 15, Helen watching her at the kitchen table, and Helen saying to me later, "Ed, that girl's going to marry the first man who can make her a picture look right, and I don't know how to teach her out of it because it's underneath her already." And that is more or less what Rebecca did. She met Trevor at a real estate office where she was answering phones after college, and Trevor could make a picture look right in a way that suited Rebecca down to the bone, and they were married inside a year. Trevor Blount, my son-in-law. And I never disliked Trevor the man, if I am being honest. I disliked what he did, which is a different thing. Trevor is in real estate, and he does a specific kind of real estate that has grown a great deal around here in the last 20 years. He buys old houses in neighborhoods on the way up, and he tears them down or guts them, and he puts up bigger, plainer, cheaper things where they used to stand, and he sells the new things for 2 and 3 times what he paid for the old ones. He calls it flipping. It is a business, and there is no law against it, and I have known men who did it honestly and made a living. Trevor did it in a stretch of years when it worked without honesty, and I think he lost the habit of doing things any other way. He looked at old houses the way you look at a piece of firewood, as something in the way of a use it hadn't been put to yet. And he looked at his father-in-law's house, sitting on a lot that had gotten expensive around us. And he did not see the porch I built for Helen the year we bought the place. He saw a tear down. I remember the first time I understood that about him, and I did not, at the time, understand what I was understanding. It was a family dinner in the 2nd or 3rd year of their marriage. Trevor was on my porch drinking a beer, waiting for Rebecca to finish helping her mother with dessert in the kitchen, and Trevor said, "Ed, this lot's really something. Have you ever thought about what you could do with it? You could take the house down, put up 2 on the parcel. I mean, look at the setbacks. You'd clear the whole thing. Between us, this lot in 5 years is going to be worth twice what your house is." He said it the way a man says a compliment. He was, I understood only years later, telling me that he had already, in his head, priced the lot without the house on it, and that the number he had gotten to made him want to be close to it. I remember I said something like, "Well, Trevor, my Helen's roses are in that yard, and I built that porch you're sitting on, and I don't much want to think about taking it down while it's still holding my beer." And Trevor laughed in the polite way and let it go, and I put it out of my mind. But I told Helen about it that night after Rebecca and Trevor had gone home, and Helen listened, and Helen did not say much, but her face got a very particular quiet on it. And later at the bathroom sink she said, "Ed, he's already walked around that lot in his head without our house on it. Just so you know he has. Not tonight, but sometime. He's going to say it again in a different room, and he's going to say it in front of Rebecca. And Rebecca is going to start walking around that lot in her head that way too. And I want us to remember later that he told you what he was tonight, and you didn't have to guess. I did not think much of it at the time. I do now. Rebecca learned that way of looking. She learned it slow, over 20 years married to Trevor, until she looked at her own childhood home and thought about it the way Trevor thought about it. And by the time her mother got sick, Rebecca and Trevor had been carrying quietly a version of a plan for this house for a long time. I know that now. I did not know it then. Then I only saw my daughter and her husband coming around more when Helen got sick, being helpful. And I welcomed it, the way any grieving father welcomes the family that shows up in a hard time. And I did not think to ask, when they were being helpful, exactly what they were being helpful with. My second child is Michael. My son, Mike. And here I have to own my own part, because the distance between Mike and me was mostly my doing, and it is the piece Rebecca and Trevor walked through most easily. Mike and I had a falling out 6 years back over a woman he married, Sarah, a good young woman, a nurse, from a background I did not think enough of in words I have regretted every day since. And Mike went ahead and married her anyway, God bless him. And Sarah turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to him, and Sarah and Mike had a daughter, Emma, who I will come to in a minute. But I was too proud to admit I had been wrong for the first years, and by the time I was ready to admit it, Helen had started to get sick, and then Helen was gone, and Mike and I were still on opposite banks of a small, stupid falling out that had turned, in the way these things do, into a canyon neither of us knew how to shout across. And that canyon was exactly the room Rebecca and Trevor needed. They filled it. They told Mike for years that I refused to hear his name, that I got upset when he was mentioned, that I had said things about his wife and his daughter that I had never said and would not have said. They told me a matching set about Mike, that Mike had told them he did not want anything more to do with his father, that he had made his choice, that he had built his life without me and did not want me in it. 2 poison stories, one for each of us, kept fresh and watered for 6 years, to keep the child who would have seen through everything as far from me as they could keep him. Because Mike is a shop teacher, Mike teaches carpentry and small engine and metals down at the high school where he has taught for 12 years. Mike is a man who works with his hands like his father, and who reads a room and reads a person the way I taught him to read a piece of wood, and who would have seen Trevor for what Trevor is inside of about 10 minutes, and would have understood what Rebecca had become inside of half an hour. Trevor knew it. Rebecca knew it. That is exactly why they made so certain Mike was nowhere near the room. I have thought a great deal since about the fact that Mike came to his mother's funeral anyway. Because he did, I found out later. I did not know it that Tuesday. But there was a man I did not quite look at all the way, sitting in the very back pew of the church in a plain dark jacket, who slipped out before the reception. And I thought, at the time, my eyes were playing tricks on me in my grief. They weren't. My son had come to his mother's funeral and sat in the back and left before I could see him because Rebecca had told him for years, the last time on the phone, the very morning of the service, that I did not want him there. And then there is Emma, Mike's daughter, my granddaughter, 15 years old, and the bright thread running through this whole dark cloth. Emma had begged her father, over the years, to bring her out to see her grandmother, and Mike had, once or twice a year, sent Emma out to spend a weekend with Helen at the house, always on days when Rebecca had arranged for me to be somewhere else, because that was the price Mike had to pay to see his mother, and Helen had accepted it in silence, which is to say, my Helen and my Emma had a whole quiet relationship for 6 years that I had no idea existed, because the price of it had been that I did not know. Helen had watched me refuse to be the first one to call my son, and had, in her quiet, stubborn way, done what she could without my knowing. And Emma, in those weekend visits, had come into Helen's kitchen the way a bright 15-year-old girl comes into a wise old woman's kitchen. And Helen had loved her, and Helen had told her about her grandfather, the carpenter, and had told her, apparently, a great many things I did not know Helen was telling her, including that if the day ever came that Emma could reach her grandfather, she should. That is what my Helen was doing behind me in the last years of her life, and I did not know it, and I owe her more for those years than I have breath left to say. And there is one last piece from before all of this that I have to tell you, and it turned out to matter more than the rest of it put together, and it was Helen's doing at a kitchen table. 40 years ago, when we were about to close on this house, Helen sat me down at the little kitchen table in the apartment we were still renting, and she made me do a thing that felt at the time like her over-worrying. Her father, a small-town country lawyer, who by then was old and not well, had gotten wind we were buying a house and had called Helen, and had apparently told her a story from his practice about an old couple whose only son had convinced them to add his name to the deed of their house, just to keep it simple, and about how that son had then, when hard times came, allowed the house to become collateral on his debts, and the old people had ended up with nothing at 80, and Helen listened to her father the way Helen listened to anyone she respected, which is to say she took it in and did not let it go. And she came to me at the kitchen table with her father's advice in her hand. She said, "Ed, I want you to hold this house in your name, in a trust, with a lawyer of my picking. Only your name, not both of us, not either of the children ever, no matter what any of them tell us 30 years from now. My father says it, and I say it, and if you love me, you'll do it, and you'll do it properly." I said, "Helen's sweetheart, Why not both of us? I want you on there. You're my wife." And Helen looked at me across that little table and she said, "Because life is long, Ed. Because kids grow up. Because if the day ever comes when somebody in our own family tries to talk one of us onto or off of that paper, I want the paper to be so plainly on one side of the line that there is no argument to be had about it. And I want the one whose name is on it to be the one who is more stubborn about keeping his promise. And you, my love, are the most stubborn man I know, and once you have promised me a thing, you will keep the promise. And if the day comes when I am not here anymore to remind you of it, I want the paper to still be right." She reached across the table, and she took my hand, and she said, "Promise me you will never, ever put anyone else's name on that paper, not one of the children, not for a nice reason, not for a soft reason, not because they told you so-and-so was easier, not for any reason at all. Promise me you will die with only your name on it, and then it will go on to whoever your and my hearts finally decide deserves it, and not one moment sooner." And she picked the lawyer, a young woman then named Margaret Chen, who is my lawyer still 40 years later. And Helen and I sat in Margaret's little office and drew up the trust. And I signed the papers, and Helen watched me do it. And Helen filed the originals in a safe deposit box at our bank, with a key she made me put on my keyring and never take off. I thought at the time she was over-worrying. I promised her to make her feel better. And Helen, my Helen who has been dead for 1 month and 1 week as of the afternoon, Rebecca handed me the box, saved my house 40 years later with that kitchen table talk. Because Rebecca and Trevor had spent months building a plan, on the assumption that the deed to my house was somewhere in the ordinary form, joint tenancy, either of us, the kind of paper a grieving old man could be talked into signing over. They did not know that a small, stubborn librarian had put a wall around this house 40 years ago, and that the only door in the wall was in the pocket of a promise Helen had asked me to keep, and that I had kept it, through 51 years of a marriage, and 8 months of a dying, and a Tuesday afternoon in a bedroom looking down at her, and every single day of the year and change since. Kept it because Helen had asked me to, and because a good carpenter keeps his promises to the person who taught him to read the grain. I sat in that study a long time after Rebecca and Trevor drove away. The light went entirely out of the window. The house made all its usual small evening sounds, the click of the heater, the settling of the beams up in the attic that has settled every winter of the last 50 years and always will. And I let myself sit with the shape of the day. I had buried my wife in the morning. I had been handed a moving box in the afternoon. I had walked back to my study and handed my daughter my Helen's 40-year-old promise in reply. And I had let them leave without a fight, because the fight I meant to have was not going to be had in an evening. It was going to be built the way I built everything else in this house, plank by plank, joint by joint, patiently, with the drawing on the table beside me, until the whole piece was solid enough to stand alone under any weight anyone put on it. But before I could put a drawing on the table, I had to make one call, and I want you to know I sat with it for another hour before I made it. Because it was the call I should have made 6 years back. On the afternoon Mike told me he was going to marry Sarah, when I said the words I have been sorry for every day since. I picked up the phone in my study, 50-year-old landline, the one Helen and I had had since we moved in, and I dialed my son. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had had the phone in his hand. He said, "Dad." Just that. His voice was rough, careful, testing the air. I said, "Mike, son, I saw you at the church this morning. I couldn't be sure. I thought maybe I was imagining you because that would have been the kind of thing my grief would do to me. But it was you, wasn't it, in the back?" There was a silence. Then he said, "It was me, Dad. I didn't stay. Rebecca called me this morning before the service. She said you didn't want me there. She said you'd said so, in words, and if I loved you, I'd not put you through it. So I sat in the back and I left before you could see me, because I did not want to put you through anything more today, of anything. And I closed my eyes at my own desk, and I said, 'Quiet. Son, I have never once said that. I have never once said any of the things she has been telling you I said for 6 years. And I know now she has been telling them to you, because your sister came into my living room this afternoon with a flattened cardboard moving box and told me it was time for me to leave the house I built. And it was the same voice, the same soft, managing, reasonable voice. She has been running that voice at both of us for a long time, Mike. She told me a matching set of stories about you for 6 years, that you had said you didn't want me in your life, that you'd built your life and had no room for your father. I believed her, God forgive me, because I was proud, and because I did not want to hear that I had hurt you as much as I had. But it was a lie. It was a lie from her mouth to my ear, and I let it live in my head for 6 years, and I let it eat 6 years I don't get back. Mike's son, I am sorry. I was wrong about Sarah on the day I said what I said, and I have been wrong about you for 6 years since, and I am not going to spend one more day being wrong. If your wife will let me across her threshold, I would like to come and apologize to her in person, and I would like to meet your daughter. And if you can find it in you to come home to your mother's house for one evening so that we can be father and son again while there's still time, I am asking you to. I don't cry easily. I was a carpenter for 52 years, and my hands and my face got used to being still. But I sat there in Helen's study at 74 years old on the afternoon of my wife's funeral, and I heard my son, on the other end of a landline I had installed 40 years back, start to cry the way a grown man cries when a thing he has been carrying for 6 years is set down. And I cried on my end at my own desk, and we did that for a while and did not try to speak. And when we could speak again, Mike said, "Dad, I'll come tomorrow. I'll bring Emma. Sarah'll come the day after if it's all right. She's on a shift she can't move." And I said, "Yes, all of it, all of you." And Mike said, "Dad, what's Rebecca doing? Tell me what she brought into the house today." And I told him about the box, about the deed, about Willowbrook, about Trevor, about what I had read on my daughter's face across her mother's flowers. And there was a silence on that phone that was a different kind of silence. The kind of silence a shop teacher gets when he watches a piece of work he already suspected was going to fail, actually break under the load. And then Mike said, in a voice that was suddenly very steady, "Dad, I want you to write down every word Rebecca said to you tonight, and every word Trevor said, and put it in an envelope in that study drawer. I want you to lock every door in that house tonight. I want you to not answer the phone if it's Rebecca until I get there. I want you to sleep. And I want you to call Mom's lawyer in the morning, Margaret Chen, right? Mom told me once, years ago, that if I ever needed to know something about the family papers, I should call Margaret. I'll come by first thing, and we'll do it together. Dad, are you all right tonight, in that house, alone?" And I said, "I'll be all right, son. Your mother's in every room in this house. I'm not alone in the way you mean." And Mike said, "Okay, Dad, I love you. I'll be there tomorrow." And I said, "I love you too, son. I have missed you. Come home." I hung up the phone in Helen's study at 74 years old, and I sat there in the dark of that room for a long while, and I said out loud to Helen, "You had a hand in that call, honey. I can feel your hand on the back of my neck. Thank you." Because she had. She had spent the last 6 years quietly building a bridge across a canyon a proud old man had let sit. And when the day came that I was ready to cross it, the bridge was there under my feet, and I walked across it, and my son answered on the second ring. The next morning, I called Margaret Chen. 40 years back, she'd been the young lawyer Helen picked out of a small firm to draw up our trust. She is nearing 70 herself now, still practicing part-time out of the same small brick building downtown, still wearing her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and still the sharpest patient, careful listener I have ever put my paperwork in front of. She had drawn up our trust when she was 31 years old, and Helen was 32, and I was 33. 3 young people in a small office picking up a piece of paper together that would sit in a file cabinet for 40 years, and, in the end, save my house. Margaret was there the day Helen and I signed. Margaret was there when we bought the house. Margaret updated the trust once when Rebecca was born and once when Mike was born, in short, careful phone calls I mostly did not pay much attention to at the time because I was busy putting up bookshelves. Margaret handled Ellen's father's estate when he passed. Margaret sat in the 3rd row of the church at Ellen's funeral in a gray suit, quiet, and I had walked past her without seeing her because I was walking past everyone. 40 years of a lawyer, done properly, is one of the things you do not know you have built until the year comes that you need it. Margaret was ours in that way, steady, careful, and holding on our side of a table, a small brown file cabinet drawer with the word Whitaker on the tab. And when I sat down with the phone in Helen's study at 74 years old and dialed her number, I understood, in the way you understand a well-cut joint when you finally get to load test it, that Helen had built me a piece of scaffolding 40 years ago that was going to hold every weight the next months could throw at it, because Helen had picked Margaret Chen, and Helen had picked well. I said, "Margaret, it's Ed Whitaker. We buried Helen yesterday, and I need to come in." And Margaret said, in a voice that changed just enough for me to hear it change, "Ed, I have been waiting for this phone call for 11 months. Come today. Come as soon as you can. Your Helen left me a package for you, and I have been carrying it in my file cabinet for you since last spring, and I have not been sure until now whether I was going to have to be the one to open it. Come." 11 months, which is to say, Helen had been to Margaret's office in the spring before her diagnosis, before either of us had any inkling of what was going to happen that summer. Helen had gone to Margaret's on some quiet Tuesday without telling me, and had put a package on Margaret's desk with instructions. I got in the car. Mike was already at my house. He'd come by first thing with a duffel bag and a 15-year-old girl he introduced to me on my own porch. And I want to tell you about that moment separately because I owe it its own telling. And Mike came with me to Margaret's office because he had said, "Quiet. Dad, whatever's in Mom's envelope, you don't need to open it alone." So it was Mike who sat next to me in Margaret's little conference room, while Margaret set a plain manila envelope down on the wood between us. And Margaret said, before I opened it, "Ed, I want to tell you what your wife told me the day she brought this in her own words as best I can remember them. She sat right where you're sitting now, and she said, 'Margaret, my Rebecca and her husband are going to try to take my house from Ed after I die. I do not know exactly how yet, and I do not know exactly when, but I have seen it in Rebecca's face for a year, and I have seen it in Trevor's business for 2, and I would rather not be right about my own daughter. But if I turn out to be right, I want to have prepared for it. So I have written 3 letters, one for Ed, my husband, who is going to need every reminder I can give him of what I asked him to promise me 40 years ago. One for Rebecca, my daughter, who is going to hear her mother's voice from beyond the grave the day she tries what I believe she will try, because I want to give her one last chance to hear her mother tell her not to. And one for Michael, my son, who is going to need his father back in his life, whether either of them thinks so on the day of my funeral or not. Margaret, if Ed calls you inside of 6 months of my death and tells you that Rebecca has made a move, I want you to deliver these envelopes exactly as I have described in the instructions. Will you promise me?" And I said, "Ed, that I would. And here is your envelope. The other 2 remain in my file for now. Read yours." I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter in Helen's small, round librarian's handwriting. "Ed, my love." If Margaret is reading this to you with you, or if she's given it to you to read to yourself, then I was right about something I did not want to be right about. And I am so sorry, because it means our girl has done a thing that could not be talked out of her by our love alone. And it means you are sitting somewhere without me. And this is my voice reaching you across the last piece of paper I could put in a drawer while I still could. So listen, because I do not have long here. First, I love you. I have loved you every day of 51 years, and I am loving you now from wherever this letter finds me. Second, keep your name on the papers. Do not, in your grief, in your loneliness, in the way you can be talked into things by a soft voice at the right hour, put anyone's name on that deed. Not Rebecca's, not Trevor's, not even Mike's. Not because he doesn't deserve it, but because you don't sign a deed over while you are still alive to it. Read the trust with Margaret. Trust Margaret. She has been mine for 40 years, and she is now yours. Third, Michael, call our son. He has been waiting 6 years. Rebecca has told him things for 6 years I could not, from where I was in the middle, undo, and I am ashamed I did not fight harder to. Please do the thing you should have done 6 years ago, and pick up the phone and tell him you were wrong about Sarah and about him. Sarah is a jewel, Ed. She is our daughter-in-law, and I love her. And I got to know her a little, in a lot of small ways you did not know about. And I want you to know her too. And their girl, Emma, Ed, our Emma. She has your hands. She has your hands, Ed. You will see it the first afternoon she stands next to you at the workbench. And I hope to God she gets that chance. Fourth, Rebecca, my Becca. I have written her a letter of my own, and Margaret has it. If she does the thing I fear she will do, please let Margaret give her that letter in front of you, and in front of witnesses who love you, and let Rebecca read it, and let her hear her mother tell her, one last time, what her mother would have told her if I had been given 10 more years to say it in person. It is my last try at reaching her, and if it doesn't reach her, then nothing was going to. And you and Michael can lay her down gently and love her the way you love a daughter who has become somebody her mother could no longer save. Fifth and last, my love, and this is the important one, forgive yourself for anything you did not do right by our children or by me. Life is long, and you were a good man in all of it, and I do not want you carrying anything you don't have to carry into the years without me. Go into the shop, teach Emma, keep the house, live, I will be waiting. You do not have to hurry. Yours forever, Ellen. Helen. She'd signed it, Helen, but she'd written Ellen first and crossed it out. Helen's name at home, between us, in the private hours, had been Ellen for a joke 50 years old that only she and I had ever known, and she had started to sign it that way, and then remembered the letter was going to be read in a room, and had switched. And that little crossed-out Ellen on the last piece of paper my Helen wrote to me was the one that put me down. I bent over Margaret's conference table, and I cried in a way I had not cried since a Tuesday afternoon in our bedroom. And Mike sat beside me with his hand on the back of my neck, and Margaret did not say a word, and the room let me cry. When I could sit up again, I looked at Margaret and I said, "Do you have Rebecca's letter?" Margaret said, "In this file, unopened. Helen sealed it. I have not read it. I will give it to Rebecca in front of you and Michael and any witnesses of your choosing on any day you say. Those are Helen's instructions, not before." I said, "Good. Not yet. Not today. There is more to find out first. Because Rebecca and Trevor did not build a plan around a moving cardboard box, Margaret, that box was the last step. There's a first and a second and a third, and I mean to know every one of them before Rebecca hears her mother's voice out of an envelope. Margaret, do you know somebody who can walk backwards through my accounts and my paperwork and Trevor's business and find everything they've been doing for the last year while my Helen was dying?" Margaret smiled, small and cold. "I do, Ed. His name is Neil Corrigan, and he is very good at this kind of thing. And I know an investigator, a retired detective named Rita Lawson, who works elder fraud cases now for people like you. And I want to tell you one more thing, Ed. Before we go one step further, Helen told me that day she brought the envelope in that she was already worried about a specific paper. She said Trevor had come by, twice in the 2 weeks before her diagnosis, with a medical power of attorney forms for you two to sign in case anything ever came up. And she said she had told you no both times, and she had watched you tell Trevor no both times, and she said, quote, "I am afraid one of those pieces of paper is going to appear anyway with Ed's signature on it, and I want you to know it isn't real if it does. Ed, did you ever, in the 8 months your wife was dying, sign a medical power of attorney with Trevor's name on it?" I sat with that a long moment, and I searched my memory carefully, in the plodding, painful way a widower searches his memory of a bad year. And I said, "Margaret, there was a paper near the end at the hospital that Trevor put a clipboard in front of me for. He said it was for the hospital, for Helen's care, for signature access at the pharmacy, some such. He said it was routine and needed to be signed today because a nurse needed it. I was 3 days from losing my wife. I signed it. I did not read it. God forgive me, I did not read it." Margaret nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods over a wound they were expecting to find. "That'll be the one, Ed. Neil will get it for us, and Rita will find out what he did with it. And when we know, we will know the whole of what your daughter and son-in-law built, and then we will decide together what to do about it, but not before then, not one step in front of the drawing, as your Helen would have said." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Ed, your wife spent the last year of her life protecting you from what she was afraid was going to happen. Let me carry a piece of that for her now. That is what she left me here to do." I looked at Margaret Chen, and I looked at my son, and I said, "All right, let's find out what they built, and then let's take it apart. Slowly, in one piece, in the right room, in front of the right people, on a day we choose. Let me tell you about the morning Mike brought Emma to my house, because it was the morning I got a whole other piece of my life back, and because it is the piece that decided how I did the rest of what I did. Mike pulled into my driveway before 8. I stood at the front window in Helen's chair, and I watched him get out of the car. He'd gotten grayer in 6 years, and he'd gotten some of my father's set of the shoulders that had skipped me. And I watched him go around to the passenger side and open the door, and out stepped a 15-year-old girl in a plain dark jacket, tall for 15, with her mother's brown eyes and my mother's mouth and, my God, my hands. Emma had my hands. Big-knuckled, wide across the palm, long-fingered, capable-looking. The hands of a person who was going to make things. She was carrying a small wrapped rectangle under her arm, and she stood on my driveway looking up at my house. The porch I built, the paint I put on last spring, and I could see her taking it in, room by window, because she'd been in that house a few times over 6 years, with her grandmother, and she remembered. I opened the front door, and I stepped out onto the porch, and Emma looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us knew what to do. So I said, from the porch, "Emma, I'm your Grandpa Ed. I have missed you. Come in the house, honey." And this 15-year-old girl, who had been raised by two good parents who had told her, I found out later, nothing but true and kind things about a grandfather she barely knew, walked up onto my porch and put her arms around my middle and hugged me. Just a plain hug, no fuss, no scene, the hug of a girl who had been ready to give one for years and had finally been given the door to walk through to do it. And she said, "Hi, Grandpa. I'm sorry about Grandma." And I stood on my porch at 74 years old, with my son behind her and my dead wife in every window. And I held my granddaughter for the first time as her grandfather, and I understood, in that hug, that whatever else was coming, my Helen had prepared the world for this too. Emma came inside. She gave me the wrapped rectangle she'd been carrying, and it was a plain small photo frame, and inside it was a photograph she had taken herself of her grandmother the last time she'd come to visit Helen. Helen sitting in that front window chair with a book on her lap, smiling at the person taking the picture. I have looked at that photograph every day since. It sits on the desk I built for Helen the year we were married. Emma had known, apparently without her father or me telling her, exactly what to bring an old man who had just lost his wife. I made them coffee and cocoa. Emma walked through the house looking at everything. The front room, the kitchen, my hands on every board of it. And I remember she stopped in front of the built-in bookshelves in the front room and put her fingertips on the joinery and looked at me and said, "Grandpa, did you cut these dovetails by hand?" And I said, "Every one, honey." And Emma nodded to herself, and she said, quiet, "I want to learn how to do that. Dad says he can teach me some, but he says the real teacher is you." And Mike, from behind her, said in a voice so full I could feel his throat catching, "That's true, Em." And I stood there in my own front room, in a house I had built with my hands, and I had my son back and my granddaughter met on the morning after I buried my wife, and it was the first morning in 8 months I had not woken up to a house that felt empty. Helen was in that room. She was standing beside every one of us watching, and I felt her. That afternoon, I took Emma down into the basement workshop, because she'd asked and because I could feel Helen at my elbow saying go, and I let a 15-year-old girl stand in front of my workbench for the first time, and I put a plane in her hand, and I put a piece of pine in the vise, and I showed her how to hold the plane, and how to read the grain, and how to push with the wood and not against it, and she took a first pass, and a shaving came off. A real shaving, thin and clean and translucent the way they come off when the tool is sharp and the hands are steady. And Emma looked at that shaving on the bench and looked up at me, and she looked at me with a face I have not seen on any other person in my life in the same way, because it was 15 years old, and it was the face I remember on my father's face when I was 15 and had brought him my first successful joint. It was the same face. 2 generations apart, the same face. And I understood that Helen had been telling me the truth in her letter. This girl had my hands. She made 2 more passes and set the plane down and said, "Grandpa, can I come here every weekend I don't have too much homework?" And I said, "Emma, you can come here every weekend for the rest of your natural life. This shop is yours whenever you want it." And Mike was standing on the basement steps watching, and Mike sat down on those steps and put his face in his hands. And I understood that my son had been carrying for 6 years a grief for me and for Emma and for himself that he had not, until that morning, been able to put down. And I let him sit with his face in his hands, and Emma and I turned a small piece of pine into a smaller piece of pine, one shaving at a time. And Helen watched from every corner of that basement, and I thought, whatever comes next, whatever we have to do about Rebecca, we have already won something today that nobody in this world can take back. That was the morning I decided I was not going to let this thing that came from my daughter reach my granddaughter. Whatever was going to happen in the next weeks, however it played out, I was going to make sure that Emma remembered this year of her life as the year her grandpa came back, not the year her aunt tried to steal his house. Everything I did from that morning on, I did with one eye always on that girl. Rebecca was not going to reach her. Trevor was not going to reach her. Whatever Rebecca had built, I was going to take it apart in a way that fell entirely on Rebecca and not one crumb on Emma. That is the promise I made in my own basement that afternoon, watching my granddaughter shave a piece of pine. And I kept it. Now, I have to tell you about the discipline of the next 3 weeks, because it was the hardest work I have done since I retired from carpentry. And it was work of a kind I have never before been asked to do. Because for those 3 weeks I had to keep looking to Rebecca and Trevor like a widower who was slowly softening toward what she'd asked me for the afternoon of the funeral. That was Margaret's guidance, and it was Rita Lawson's guidance, and it was Mike's guidance, and it was, once I gave myself over to it, the right one. Because if Rebecca knew I had woken up, she would move on whatever she had left, burn what she could burn, hide what she could hide, and lock down her story before I could get every piece of the truth on a table. But if she thought her father, in his grief, was coming around, if she thought the moving box in my living room had merely landed a day too early and now, in the raw weeks after burying my wife, was starting to look to me like the sensible thing my daughter had said it was, then she and Trevor would keep doing what they were doing. And they would keep leaving footprints while Neil Corrigan and Rita Lawson followed them. I want to tell you what those 3 weeks cost, because if you have never had to do it, you cannot imagine the cost. Rebecca called me on the Wednesday, the day after the funeral, in her most contrite voice. She said, "Daddy, I've been thinking about last night, and I feel awful. I was so worried about you being alone in that house, and I brought the box in the wrong way. I know that. Trevor said I should have waited a few weeks. I want to apologize." I said, mild. "Rebecca, honey, I know you meant well. It was a hard day. Let's leave it for now. We'll talk when I've had some time." And I heard her relief through the line, the way you can hear a person on the phone recalibrate a plan. She thought she had bought her way back to the table. Good. That's what I wanted her to think. Because in fact, she had bought me 3 weeks to lay the drawing down. She started dropping by. Twice that first week, 3 times the second. Always with a casserole. Always with a soft version of the same story. Daddy, don't misunderstand about Willowbrook. It wasn't a facility exactly. It was a really nice community. More like a nice apartment building for grown-ups your age. Daddy, we just don't want you to be alone here. We can help with anything you need. I can come sit with you tomorrow if you'd like. Daddy, if you ever do decide the house is too much, promise me you'll let Trevor help you with the sale. You don't want to get taken by strangers. Trevor came too once with a bottle of good bourbon and the manner of a man who is making sure a business relationship stays warm. He never sat close enough to me to feel real, but he said kind things and asked after me and told me about a young couple he knew who had bought a really lovely place, easy to keep up. They were so happy in it. He was already, at that dinner, subtly selling me a specific alternative housing situation. He didn't quite name Willowbrook. He didn't need to. And seeds were being watered at his own careful pace. And I sat through all of it. I sat at my own kitchen table and let my daughter tell me a story about her Willowbrook that I now knew, from Neil Corrigan's second phone call, was a place at which she had already, 8 months earlier, put a deposit down on a specific room. I sat through Trevor's bourbon and listened to him tell me about a nice, easy-to-keep-up place, while I knew, from Rita Lawson's file, that he had listed my house, with a realtor colleague of his named Nina Pratt, in an off-MLS quiet listing dated 2 weeks before Helen died, at a price that had my address on it in black and white on a document Nina Pratt had signed and Trevor had signed and I had never seen. I sat with a piece of that knowledge in my chest at every visit, and I did not let it show on my face. And by the end of those 3 weeks, I understood better than I ever have why 60 years behind a carpenter's bench had prepared me to sit at that table. Because a carpenter learns not to react. A carpenter learns that the wood does not care how you feel about a bad joint. The wood cares only what you do next, and what you do next is you go slowly, and you check the drawing, and you keep your temper down where it belongs. I kept it, because I had a drawing to finish, and meanwhile, Neil and Rita were finishing it, layer by layer, and I want to tell you every layer, because it deserves to be named. The first layer was the medical power of attorney. Neil pulled it. The paper Trevor had put in front of me in Helen's hospital room 3 days before she died was not a medical POA. Or rather, it was a medical POA, but it was a medical POA drafted by Trevor's lawyer, Buddy, a fellow named Kevin Ross, notarized by Kevin Ross's own office, that had a great deal more inside it than signature access at the pharmacy for Helen's meds. It included durable power of attorney for financial matters. It included authority to act on my behalf on real estate transactions. It included, buried at the bottom, a specific authority to open lines of credit in my name. Trevor had put it in front of me on a clipboard at 4 a.m. in the ICU 3 nights before Helen died, and he had told me it was routine, and it wasn't routine, and I had signed it, and Kevin Ross had notarized it 2 days later, without me present in a way that Margaret told me plainly would not survive a hard look from a bar association. Trevor had, from the moment I signed, been legally, on paper, able to act as my agent on almost anything. The second layer was what he had done with it. Trevor had moved money from my accounts, small enough at first that I would not notice, larger by month 6 as Helen got sicker and I was less able to look. Total across 8 months. More than I want to name here in one figure, but it was in the mid-6 digits. He had moved it into a company account he had set up specifically for the purpose. A company that, on paper, looked like a family investment vehicle. And out of that account he had funded, among other things, an over-leveraged flip he'd been sinking in for 18 months and could not have kept afloat without a fresh injection of exactly the amount he had taken from me. My money had, quietly, saved Trevor's business for the year my Helen was dying. That was the money layer, and I sat with it for a full night in my study before I could look at it without wanting to break something. The third layer was the house. Trevor had, 2 weeks before Helen died, contracted with Nina Pratt for a quiet off-MLS listing of my house. Not a real listing yet, because he could not close a sale on a property he did not own, but a listing agreement that identified my property by address, that stated a price, that named Trevor as the seller's authorized representative, and that had been shopped to a small circle of investor buyers Nina worked with. Trevor's plan, Rita made me understand, had been this. At some point after Helen's death, when I was raw and confused, he would present me with a purchase offer from one of Nina's investors, dressed up as an act of family kindness. Ed, we know a couple who love the neighborhood. They'll pay all cash. It's the easiest possible transaction. You can be in Willowbrook by Christmas. And he would get me to sign a deed, and it would be Kevin Ross who notarized it, and it would go to record, and by the time I'd cleared my head enough to understand what I'd done, my house would be owned by Nina's investor, which was Nina's investor on paper only, because underneath the shell it was Trevor. Trevor was going to buy my house from me at half its value, at the softest hour of my life, and then flip it a year later for 3 times what he paid me. That was the plan. The moving box on the afternoon of the funeral had been step 1. Get me out of the house in my head before we get you out of the house on paper. The 4th layer was Willowbrook. Rebecca had, the very week of Helen's diagnosis, called Willowbrook Senior Living and put a $5,000 deposit down on a specific room, a single-occupancy studio on the 2nd floor with a window on the west side. The deposit had been paid, Neil told me carefully, from an account of Rebecca's own, because there was a paper trail there, and Rebecca had wanted it to look like she was the loving daughter making arrangements out of her own pocket. But the money in that account of Rebecca's had come, 4 days before the deposit, from a wire transfer from Trevor's company account, which was the account Trevor was drawing out of mine. So, the deposit for the studio at Willowbrook, put down on a specific room the week Helen was diagnosed, had been paid, ultimately out of my own money. My money, taken while my wife was dying, had funded my future storage. That's the layer that took the last of the wind out of me. The 5th and cruelest layer was the movers, because there were movers. Rebecca had booked, 6 weeks before Helen died, a moving company for the Wednesday after the funeral, the Wednesday after, 24 hours after Rebecca handed me a flattened box. On the Tuesday afternoon of the burial, professional movers were scheduled to arrive at my house at 8 in the morning on Wednesday to pack me up. She had scheduled the movers before her mother was even in hospice. That was the depth of the planning. That is what Rebecca had been carrying quietly on her phone calendar for 8 months of her mother's dying. A mover and storage appointment at 8 a.m. Wednesday for her father's furniture. She had walked into my living room on the Tuesday afternoon with a flattened cardboard box and told me the house was too big for one old man, and had known, in her hand, that the movers would be pulling up my driveway at 8 the next morning to make it so. Rita brought me that booking on paper, and I sat at my desk and looked at it, and I thought about my daughter, and I thought about the 15-year-old girl in a plain dark jacket who had put a photograph of my dying wife in my hand on my front porch the same morning, and I thought about which one of those two people I was going to give what remained of my life to, and there wasn't a question left. And the sixth layer, which was Rita's own contribution, was the texts and the emails. Because Trevor and Rebecca had been text messaging each other about the plan for months, in a private thread they had never once imagined would ever be read out loud. Rita didn't have all of them, but Neil had access later, through the discovery process Margaret filed, to some. And there were 3 passages in that thread I want you to hear about, because they are the ones I keep, and because they matter to the whole story. 2 weeks before Helen died, Rebecca wrote to Trevor, "Mom is going to go this week or next. When she does, we hit him Tuesday of the funeral, not the next week, that day. He'll be too broken to fight, and if we let him have a week to think, he'll harden. He has to sign the deed within the month." A month before Helen died, Trevor wrote to Rebecca, "Kevin says the POA holds up as long as we don't push it too hard on any single item. Don't move any big number this month. Wait till Mom's gone and Dad's out of the house. After that, we can do the transfer in one shot with Ed thinking it's just paperwork Nina's holding." And 1 week before Helen died, this is the one. Rebecca wrote back, "I don't feel great doing it while she's still alive. But Trev, she'd want us to be taken care of. She'd want it for us. She'd want us to be taken care of. She'd want it for us. My Helen, being invoked by her own daughter as the reason my Helen's home should be taken from me while my Helen was still breathing." I sat with that quote a long time, and I thought about the letter in Margaret Chen's file, and I thought, Rebecca, honey, your mother did write a letter to somebody about all this. And it wasn't the one you're imagining. I have come to think of Trevor's whole 8-month plan as a machine, a fine, elaborate machine, patient and careful, with the POA as the drive shaft, and the shell company as the gearbox, and the listing agreement, and the mover contract, and the Willowbrook deposit as the belts running off it. All of it engineered to grab hold of my life and start turning it into cash. And Trevor threw the switch on the machine in the corridor of an ICU with a clipboard, and the machine roared to life. The money moved, the paper flew, the appointments got booked, the whole long contraption spinning at full speed, and every single grip it needed to make on the actual thing it was meant to seize, every single one, closed on empty air. Because the house was in a trust set up 40 years ago that Trevor did not know existed. Because the deed had one name on it, and it wasn't a name any of Trevor's paper could reach. Because the trust was administered by a lawyer of Helen's picking who had been in her office listening to Helen's plan a year before Trevor knew he was going to need one. Because the will Ed Whitaker had signed was in the drawer of a desk Ed Whitaker had built with his own hands. And a POA cannot reach a drawer. Trevor could run that machine as hard and as long as he wanted. It was never going to bite into anything. He was a man sawing furiously at a chain that was not there, sweating and straining and getting nowhere, while the actual door stood quietly locked a few feet away, and the only key was in the pocket of an old carpenter he had already written off. And when the machine finally coughed to a stop, on a Sunday in my kitchen with a detective in the pantry doorway, all of it, the shell, the listing, the movers, the room at Willowbrook, 8 months of patient greed, turned out to have been running in place the whole time, on an appliance Helen had unplugged 40 years before. While Neil and Rita were doing that patient careful work, Margaret was doing hers on the legal side, and I was doing mine on the family side. Because you cannot do this alone, and you should not, and part of what a good drawing looks like is that the right people are named on the plan before you cut the first joint. Sarah came out to the house at the end of that first week with Mike, and I met my daughter-in-law properly for the first time. I stood on my porch, and Sarah walked up my walk in her nurse's coat because she had come straight from a shift, and I said to her, "Sarah, I want to apologize before we go inside. 6 years ago I said things to my son I should never have said about you, and I have carried them in my mouth ever since. And I have never once spoken them out loud to you or to him because I was proud and I was stupid. I was wrong about all of it. I want to say that on my own porch before you come across it, so that when you come in as my son's wife and my granddaughter's mother, and if you'll have it, my daughter-in-law. And I would like a chance to try again." And Sarah, my Sarah, this good, tired woman who had raised my granddaughter without me and put up with me being a jackass for 6 years without giving up on Mike. Sarah looked at me a long moment, and then she stepped forward and hugged me on my own porch and said quiet in my ear, "Ed, Helen told me last summer you'd come around when you were ready. She said we just had to give you time. She was right." And I closed my eyes at that, because Helen had been having conversations behind my back for years to prepare Sarah for the day her old fool of a father-in-law walked through the last of his own pride. And Helen had done that work for me too, and there is not going to be a day of the years I have left when I don't owe her another thank you for it. We sat at my kitchen table, Sarah and Mike and Emma and me, and I told them everything Neil and Rita had found, every layer, the POA, the money, the listing, Willowbrook, the movers, the texts. Emma sat very still through the whole thing and didn't say a word, and when I was done, she said, in that plain, quiet 15-year-old voice, "Grandpa, she was going to make you leave the house." And I said, "She was going to try, honey." And Emma said, "Are you going to let her?" And I said, "No, Emma, I am not. I am going to answer her in the way your grandmother taught me to answer things. Slowly and with a drawing on the table, and once, cleanly, in front of the right people. And your father and mother and I are going to talk about what you're old enough to know about the rest of it, and what you're going to leave to us. But I want to tell you the important part now, and I want you looking at me when I say it." And she looked up, and she had her grandmother's eyes underneath a 15-year-old girl's face. And I said, "Emma, whatever your Aunt Rebecca has done, none of it is yours. You do not inherit a person's wrongs from your family, not the fault and not the shame. You are your own person, and what you are is a smart, kind, capable girl with the hands of a carpenter. And that is worth more to me than this house and every dollar it will ever be worth. Whatever happens in this family, you and I are solid, and your grandmother wanted you and me solid, and we are going to be, all right?" And Emma nodded once and said, "All right, Grandpa." And Sarah reached over and took her daughter's hand, and Mike swallowed hard. And there was a quiet at that table that was, at that moment, worth the whole rest of the plan I had to build. And with Margaret on the legal side, I did the slow, careful work of undoing every hole in the fence Trevor had cut. I did not do it fast. I did it in one clean sequence, and it was a satisfying thing to build. First, Margaret filed a formal revocation of the medical power of attorney, effective on paper and served on Trevor and on Kevin Ross, on a day of my choosing so as not to tip Rebecca. Margaret walked me through the specific language of it, and I signed it in her office. Second, we froze the accounts Trevor had access to under the POA, and moved what was in them into new accounts at a different institution, in a new arrangement Margaret and I built specifically to make Trevor's access to my money end at a wall. Third, we canceled, quietly, through a real estate lawyer Margaret worked with, the off-MLS listing agreement with Nina Pratt, on the grounds that Trevor had no legal authority to have signed one in the first place, and served notice on Nina and on Trevor. Fourth, we canceled the Willowbrook deposit and got Rita's letter into the file at Willowbrook, explaining exactly what had happened, so that if anyone from Rebecca's or Trevor's side ever tried again to move me into that place, the record would be there. Fifth, we canceled the Wednesday after the funeral movers, and Margaret told them plainly in writing that Rebecca had booked the appointment fraudulently. All of it done in one careful week, none of it visible to Rebecca or Trevor from the outside, because none of the notices went out yet. That was the part that took discipline. Margaret and I built the whole reversal, every wall around every hole Trevor had cut, and we did not serve any of the notices. We put them all into a folder on Margaret's desk, in order, with dates, ready to be sent out on a single business day of our choosing, because we did not want Trevor or Rebecca to know the door was closing until it had closed on all of them at once. One clean cut, not 100 small ones over 3 weeks that Trevor could feel and adjust to. One morning, everything at once. That was the drawing. Margaret also, at my request, drafted a new will and read every line of it aloud to me with Mike sitting beside me, and I signed it, and it was witnessed properly, and it went into a folder on Margaret's desk beside all the rest. Rebecca was written out, not out of the family and not out of my heart, and I did not enjoy doing it, but plainly and precisely and completely written out of any part of my estate. The house, the trust, was written to go to Emma, held by Mike as trustee until she came of age, with the specific instruction that the shop and the tools and the workbench were hers from the day she was old enough to want them, which appeared to be already. Mike got a share to raise his family with. Rebecca got a small provision I owed her as a father, and no more. And Margaret, watching me sign, said, "Ed, your Helen would say the drawing looks true." And I said, "Well, Margaret, the drawing was hers in the end. I only cut what she planned. And then, and only then, did we pick the day. I picked a Sunday, 3 weeks and 1 day after Helen's funeral. I invited Rebecca and Trevor to a Sunday supper at my house to sit down and talk about how we go forward, because I've been thinking about what you said, sweetheart, and I want to be practical. And I heard Rebecca's relief on the phone and Trevor's satisfaction in the background because they thought, as I had wanted them to think for 3 weeks, that Daddy had softened and that Sunday supper at my house was going to be the meal where I finally, in my grief, agreed to what my daughter had asked me for. They said they'd bring the wine and the dessert. Rebecca sounded, on the phone, warm and grateful, and busy already thinking about a paper she was going to get me to sign. They did not know that Mike and Sarah and Emma were going to be there. They did not know that Margaret was going to be there. They did not know that Neil and Rita were going to be there. They did not know that Detective Marcus Hale of the county's Financial Crimes Unit, who had by that point spent 3 hours with Rita in Margaret's office and had come to certain conclusions of his own, was going to be there, sitting in the back with a plain jacket and a cup of coffee. And they did not know, because Margaret had held it in a sealed envelope in her file for 11 months, that Helen had written a letter to Rebecca herself, in her own handwriting, and that Margaret was going to hand it to Rebecca at that supper, and that Rebecca was going to be asked to read it out loud in the same steady voice her father had asked her to read the deed out loud in 3 weeks earlier, in the same house, with the same wife and mother in every room of it. That was the drawing. I spent the Saturday before it setting the house in order. I dusted Helen's chair. I put Emma's photograph of Helen on the desk in my study. I opened the drawer that had the leather folder, and I laid the deed on top, and beside it the revocation of Trevor's POA and the new will and Margaret's whole folder of notices. And I closed the drawer, and I sat at that desk a while, thinking about what a life is and about what a good marriage does, and about the 4 decades of promises Helen and I had kept, and about the one Rebecca was about to find out I had never broken. And I went down into the basement afterward, and I made one small thing. I took a scrap of oak I had left from a shelf I'd built for Emma the month before, and I cut it into 2 little pieces, and I hand-cut a small dovetail on each, and I fit them together, and the joint went home clean without glue, the way a good dovetail will. And I put the little corner on the shelf above my workbench next to the plane. It's still there. I did not need it for anything. I made it because I wanted, one more time before the day, to feel in my hands the thing my hands had been for 52 years. A carpenter who reads the grain and takes a scrap of oak and makes a joint that holds under its own patience with no other help. Because Sunday was going to ask a great deal of my hands, and I wanted to know, in my body, that they were still the hands that could hold what they were being asked to hold. And when the joint went home clean, I sat on the stool at my workbench a long moment, and I thought about my Helen, and about the morning we bought this house, and about the drawing I had cut every piece of my life to, and I felt her hand on the back of my neck the way I felt it when we were young, and I knew that whatever came through my front door the following evening, my hands were equal to it. I went to bed early, and I slept the sleep of a man who had done his work as carefully as he knew how, and now had only to see it stand, and I woke up on Sunday morning ready. They came at 5. Rebecca had brought a bottle of good wine and a bakery pie, and she came in with her chirpy hosting warmth and hugged me at the door, and Trevor came in behind her with his professional son-in-law's smile and shook my hand, and they walked into my front room, and their faces did what I knew they would do because Mike and Sarah and Emma were sitting there in the front room already, waiting. Mike had gotten up when the door opened and was standing in the middle of the front room in a plain dark shirt, his hands relaxed at his sides. Sarah was sitting on the couch with her arm along the back of it. Emma was in Helen's chair by the front window, which was where she had asked to sit, and which had felt right to me. And Rebecca froze in my doorway, and Trevor stopped just behind her, and Rebecca, my Rebecca, who had for 6 years told me my son wanted nothing to do with me, said, in a voice she could not quite steady, "Daddy, I didn't know Mike was going to be here." I said, "Sit down, sweetheart, and Trevor. There are a couple of other people I'd like you to meet too before we eat. Come on into the kitchen." Rebecca and Trevor followed me into my own kitchen, which is a route they have walked 100 times. And Rebecca's eyes went first to Margaret Chen sitting at my kitchen table in her reading glasses, and then to Neil Corrigan beside her with a plain manila folder in front of him, and then to Rita Lawson leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, and then, at the back of the kitchen, in the doorway to the pantry, where he had been standing quietly, to Detective Marcus Hale, in a plain jacket, with his badge visible on his belt. Rebecca's whole face changed color. Trevor took one step back toward the front room and then thought better of it and stopped where he was. I said, still quiet, "Rebecca, Trevor, sit down at this table. I need you both to sit down at this table with me and my family. This is my daughter's mother's house, and this is where we are going to talk about the last year, all of it. Please sit." They sat, because there was, plainly, nothing else to do. I did the same thing at that table that a good carpenter does when he is going to show his apprentice a bad piece of work. I laid the drawing down first, calmly, and I asked each of the people around it to name the thing they knew, one at a time, so that Rebecca and Trevor would hear the whole shape of the piece before I said a word of my own. That is the way I did it, not so I could enjoy watching them, God no. So that when it was over, they could not tell themselves any story about the afternoon in which anyone at the table had been mistaken, or spoken out of turn, or been anything but plainly professional. Everything they were about to hear was going to come out of the mouths of people whose job it was to know what they knew. That is a drawing that stands. I looked at Margaret first, and I said, "Margaret, would you begin with the deed to this house, please, and the trust? Read aloud what you read aloud to me the morning after the funeral." And Margaret did. She named the deed. She named the trust. She named the date of establishment, the 5th day of May, 1984, and she named the sole trustee and sole owner as Edward Whitaker. And she named the fact that no amendment or transfer had been made or was pending. And she named the fact that no power of attorney or other instrument could act on that trust except through me, personally. She read it in the same voice she had read the trust to Ellen and me 40 years ago. Rebecca knew that voice. Rebecca had sat across a table from Margaret on the day her mother's estate opened up, and Rebecca sat and listened to Margaret Chen name every reason the plan she had built for 8 months had never once been possible. I looked at Margaret again, and I said, "Now, Margaret, please tell Rebecca what her mother left in your file 11 months ago." And Margaret did. She named the 3 letters. She named Helen's instructions. She said that the letter to Rebecca had been sitting in her file for 11 months, sealed, and she said that her instruction from Helen had been to deliver it in Rebecca's presence, in Ed's presence, if and when Rebecca made a move on the house. And Margaret said, plain, "I have that letter here today, Rebecca, and in a few minutes I am going to hand it to you, and I am going to ask you to read it out loud. But before that, your father wants a few other things read first, so we will do those first." Rebecca had gone very still. Trevor was watching Detective Hale in the pantry doorway, and Trevor's face was working on a calculation, and I could see it working. I said, "Neil, would you please tell my daughter and her husband what you have found in my accounts for the last year?" And Neil did. He was flat and unhurried, the way I asked him to be. He named the medical power of attorney and the date of my signature and the notary of record and the fact that its scope did not, on any reasonable reading, match what Trevor had represented it to be. He named every transfer out of my accounts in the 8 months before Helen's death and the 8 weeks after. He named the shell company. He named the amounts. He named the specific flip Trevor had been sinking that got saved by the injection of my money. He named the wire transfer from Trevor's company account into Rebecca's account 4 days before the Willowbrook deposit. And he named the total. Rebecca's mouth was open a little. Trevor was looking at his hands. I said, "Rita, would you please tell them what you have on the house and the movers?" And Rita did. She named the off-MLS listing agreement with Nina Pratt, and she read out its date, 2 weeks before Helen died. And she named the price, and she named the seller's authorized representative signature. And she named the mover contract Rebecca had signed 6 weeks before Helen died for the Wednesday after the funeral. She held them all up, one at a time, in a clear plastic sleeve, and put them back down on the table. And I said, "Now, Rita, would you please read the 3 passages from the text messages between Trevor and Rebecca that we have discussed?" And Rita, in a voice that carried no heat and no color, read them, all 3 of them. Rebecca closed her eyes when Rita read the "she'd want us to be taken care of" passage. Trevor stared at the wall. Nobody at the table moved. Then Detective Hale stepped forward from the doorway. He did not need to say much because his presence had said most of it already. He said, "Mr. and Mrs. Blount, My name is Detective Marcus Hale. I am with the county's Financial Crimes Unit. I have been briefed extensively on this matter by Ms. Lawson and by Ms. Chen and by Mr. Corrigan. Mr. Whitaker has not yet made a decision as to whether to file a formal complaint. But I want you to know I am present today. And I want you to know that if a complaint is filed, we will be moving on it based on the record you have just heard read out. You may want to consult attorneys tomorrow, not tonight. Tonight you are going to finish this conversation with Mr. Whitaker and his family. Am I understood? Rebecca nodded once, small. Trevor said, "Yes, sir." And then it was time for Helen's letter, because Margaret had done what she had promised Helen she would do, and had held that envelope in her file for 11 months for exactly this hour. Margaret slid the sealed envelope across my kitchen table to my daughter. Rebecca stared at it. Rebecca knew her mother's handwriting on the front. I knew because I had watched Rebecca stare at pieces of paper her mother had written on for 42 years. And Rebecca reached out and took the envelope in a hand that had begun to tremble. She opened it. She unfolded the letter. It was 2 pages of Helen's small, round librarian's handwriting. Margaret said, gentle, "Rebecca, your mother asked me to ask you to read it out loud, every word, all the way through. You do not have to. If you would rather I read it, I will. But your mother asked." There was a very long pause. Rebecca looked at the paper. Rebecca looked at me. Rebecca looked at the empty chair beside me at the table, which Helen had used to sit in for 42 years of Sunday suppers, and which nobody had sat in tonight because it was Helen's. And my daughter Rebecca, who had handed me a flattened cardboard box on the afternoon of her mother's funeral, took a breath, and she began to read her mother's letter to her out loud at her mother's kitchen table, in a voice that broke on the second sentence and did not unbreak. I want to tell you what Helen's letter said, as best I can, because it was the most important document any member of my family has ever put in front of any of the rest of us, and because it is the thing that really ended the plan Rebecca and Trevor had built. Rebecca read it in her own voice through tears at my kitchen table. Margaret has the original. Rebecca has a copy. I do not have it in my hand as I tell you this, but I have heard it read 3 times now, twice from Rebecca and once from Margaret at Helen's headstone the following spring. And I have it, most of it, by heart. My Becca, if Margaret is handing you this letter, then I have died, and something has happened that I did not want to be right about. So, let me tell you a few things, sweetheart, while I still have the chance. First, I love you. I have loved you every day of 43 years. You are my only daughter, and you were a light in my life from the day you were born. And I want you to know that whatever you have done, or whatever you have not done, I loved you into it, and I love you now on the other side of it. That is not going to change from wherever I am. Second, I saw you, sweetheart. I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because I loved you enough to see you, and I want you to know that I did, and to know that your mother was not fooled. I saw the way you started to look at this house after Trevor came into your life. I saw the way you looked at me the year I got sick. I saw the way you and Trevor came around more that year, in a way you had not come around for the 10 years before, and I saw what your hands started doing at my kitchen counter. The little notes, the small, casual questions about the house, about accounts, about Daddy's mind. And I saw the way Trevor had already started drafting the paper he brought Daddy at the hospital. I saw all of it. And I did not confront you because I hoped you would stop. I did not want to be a mother who spent her last months of life at war with her only daughter. I am not sorry I chose to spend those months quietly with you and your father instead. I would choose it again. But sweetheart, I want you to know I saw. Third, your father did not know. Not until now. I hid it from him because I did not want him to spend the last months of my life fighting with his daughter and losing his son to it too. And because I thought that if I just kept the papers right, if I just kept the trust right and kept Margaret in place, and kept my Ed's promise to me 40 years ago intact, then the paper would win when the fight came, whether or not your father was awake for it. And I was right, at least on paper. Fourth, and this is the hardest thing to write, your brother, Michael. You have kept your brother from your father for 6 years. I know you have. I know because you kept your brother from me too, for a while, before I found a way around it. I have been talking to Michael on the phone for 4 years without your father. Or you knowing, sweetheart, and I have been seeing Emma for 4 years without any of you knowing. And I want you to know that I know exactly what you told Michael I was saying about him, and I have told Michael the truth of it in words he can be sure of, so that whatever version of me you have been feeding him for 6 years does not survive one more day past this letter. I love your brother, and I love his family, and I have brought them to my kitchen while you were not looking. And I have loved my Emma across a whole part of her childhood you thought I did not know she was in. I did that because I could not let a child of ours grow up without her grandmother when she wanted a grandmother. And now I am dead, and I am giving my Ed his son back. And if that letter goes to Michael, as I have asked Margaret to send it, then he already knows what I have written to him too. Fifth, Trevor, sweetheart, he is not a good man. He is not the worst kind of not good man. He is the kind who is quietly not good, and who has taught you slowly, over 20 years, to look at people the way he looks at houses, as things that are in the way of a use they have not been put to yet. I do not know if you can come back from that. I have prayed you would. Sixth and last, forgive yourself, sweetheart. I do not know what you have done by the time this reaches you. If it has reached you, then it is bad enough that Margaret has felt the need to hand it over. But you are my daughter, and I loved you all your life, and I love you across whatever line you are on right now. And I would rather you live a long life reckoning with what you did than live a shorter one hiding from it. Please, Becca, let the paper be. Do not spend the next 20 years trying to talk your father out of the promise he made me 40 years ago. It is not going to work, because the paper is written the way I asked him to write it, and because your father is more stubborn than you ever gave him credit for. But more than that, sweetheart, do not spend the next 20 years being a person your mother could not have loved, because you were and you are my little girl, and I loved you the day you were born, and I love you as I write this, and I love you still. I love you, Becca. Try harder. Choose better. Come back. Yours forever, Mama. That is more or less what Helen wrote, and that is what Rebecca read out loud, in a voice that broke and did not unbreak, at my kitchen table in front of every witness we had gathered. And when Rebecca got to the words, I love you, Becca. Try harder. Choose better. Come back. Yours forever, Mama. Rebecca put her forehead down on my kitchen table, on top of the letter, and she cried the way I have not heard my daughter cry since she was 3 years old and had fallen off her bicycle and cut her chin. She cried like a 3-year-old. She cried like a woman who had heard her mother tell her plainly that her mother saw her and had loved her anyway, and had known everything Rebecca had done, and had left her a letter across the grave saying, please come back. And in that moment, the plan Rebecca and Trevor had built ended. Not because Detective Hale was in the room, though he was. Not because Margaret had the deed in the trust and the new will in a folder on my kitchen counter, though she did. Not because Neil had the money trail and Rita had the movers and the listing and the texts, though they did. It ended because Rebecca had put her forehead down on her mother's letter and cried, and Trevor had watched his wife cry, and Trevor had understood in one clean pass, because Trevor is not stupid, whatever else he is, that there was no room left in that kitchen for the version of Rebecca he had spent 20 years building. Trevor did what people like him always do the second the pressure gets real. He tried to sell her out to save his own skin. He said, into the crying, This was mostly Becca, honestly. She's been the one pushing all of this. I was just going along. I never wanted the movers so early. The POA thing, that was Kevin's idea. He drafted it. I just handed it to Ed at the hospital. I didn't even know what was in it. And Rebecca, at that, lifted her head off the letter and looked at Trevor with a face I had never seen on her, ever, in 42 years of being her father. And she said, quiet, Trevor, shut up. Just shut up. She looked down at the letter again. She looked at me. And she said, into a silence that had gone very still, Dad, I'm sorry. Dad, Dad, I don't have words for it. I did what Mom said I did. Trevor and I did what she said we were going to do. I heard her voice reading that just now, and I heard my own voice trying to make Trevor's plan sound normal for a year, and I don't know how I let myself. I don't. I don't have anything to say for myself. I don't. I have thought a lot about what I said next, because it was the part of the afternoon that was mine to say, and because I had to say it in front of my son and my daughter-in-law and my granddaughter and Margaret and Rita and Neil and Detective Hale, and above all in front of my daughter, who had just heard her mother's voice out of an envelope. I did not enjoy saying it, but I had it prepared in my study, in a small pocket of the same folder that held the deed and the trust and the notices, and I spoke it into that kitchen the way a carpenter drives a fastener home, once, cleanly, hard enough to hold. I said, "Rebecca, I want to say the words that come next in front of everyone at this table, because I want them said cleanly, and I want you to hear them cleanly, and I do not want to have to say them again down the road when either of us has had time to talk ourselves into a different version. So, listen. You handed me a flattened moving box the afternoon we buried your mother. You did it after 8 months of your husband stealing from me while she was dying. You did it after 11 months of your mother watching you turn into somebody she did not want you to become. And you did it with movers already booked and a room at a facility already deposited on and a listing on this house already signed. You planned every step of it. You executed it. And you invoked your mother, my Helen, as the reason it was all right. You told your husband in writing that your mother would want you to be taken care of. Rebecca. You do not get to invoke my Helen for this. You do not get to speak in my Helen's name to justify taking her house from me. That is the line that got crossed, and there is no walking it back, and I want you to hear me say it out loud so you will remember I said it. Not tomorrow, not next year, not when you have talked yourself into a story where none of this was as bad as it was. You did what you did. Your mother saw you doing it. She wrote you a letter about it before she was even sick. You just read that letter out loud yourself. So there is no story left to tell about it. There is only what you do next. Now, here is what is going to happen, not what could happen, not what I might do. What is going to happen tonight in this kitchen? Margaret has drafted a set of documents and a set of notices, and they will go out tomorrow morning, first thing. Every account, every trust, every paper you and Trevor have touched will be locked, and the notices will make plain in writing that you have no authority to touch anything of mine now or ever. That is done. Second, Trevor will make full restitution of every dollar he took out of my accounts, and he will do it out of whatever he has left. A house he owns, a business he barely has, savings I don't much care about the state of. And he will do it under a court-supervised schedule Detective Hale and Margaret have already sketched. Every dollar, not a penny short. Because I am not doing this for the money, Trevor, I did not need the money, but I am also not letting you keep $1 of what you took from a dying woman's husband. If restitution comes in whole and quickly, and if you agree to a settlement agreement that Margaret is going to hand you tomorrow, then Detective Hale's file may or may not turn into charges. That is his call. It is not mine, and I have told him it is not mine to make. But you should understand tonight that a file exists, and it is complete, and it does not go away because you have the good manners to cry at my kitchen table. Third, and this one, Rebecca, is for you, and not for Trevor. You are my daughter. You will always be my daughter. I am not throwing my daughter out of my family, and I will not have anybody in this room ever tell any child in this family a story where their Aunt Rebecca is a person who cannot be spoken of. That happened to my son and to me for 6 years, and it is not happening to another generation. So, you are my daughter, but you are also, starting tonight, a daughter who has done a specific thing, and a daughter I no longer trust with any part of my life that requires trust. You will not be on the papers. You will not be on the accounts. You will not have my house. You will not have my keys. If you come back into this family and do the long, slow work of becoming a person your mother could have loved, then you will find me here, and I will love you across whatever room I have to love you across. But there is not going to be a papers and money version of that. There is only going to be the human version, which is the one your mother asked you to do in her letter, and it is going to be up to you to do it. I forgive you, Rebecca, because I do, tonight, in front of everyone, so that everyone hears it, but I will not trust you again. Forgiveness is what I give you tonight to set my own self free. Trust is a paper you spent, and it is spent. Those two things are not the same, and it is time you knew the difference. Fourth, Trevor, you are not my son. You are not going to be my son. When Rebecca becomes whoever she is going to become, if you are still standing beside her, then I will be civil to you at Christmas, and that is the whole of it. You do not, as of tonight, get a key to any door of mine, and you do not get to speak in this house on any matter concerning me, and if I ever hear that you have approached my granddaughter, or my son, or my daughter-in-law about anything at all, I will call Detective Hale personally, and we will finish the conversation his file has started. Am I understood?" Trevor said, in a voice smaller than I have ever heard him use. "Yes, sir," I said. "Good. Then go home. Both of you, sleep. Margaret's papers will be at your door tomorrow. And Rebecca, sweetheart, take the letter. Take it home. Take your mother's letter home and read it 100 times. And let it be the first pass at whatever you decide to do with the year you have left. That is what she wrote it for." Rebecca left with the letter in her hand. Trevor left behind her, not touching her, walking a half step apart from his wife the whole way to the car. And I stood at my front door with Mike beside me and watched them drive away from the house Rebecca had come to that afternoon with a bottle of wine and a pie and a plan she was sure of. It was the second time in a month my daughter had driven away from that house at the end of a plan, and this time there was no flattened box in the back seat. There was only her mother's handwriting in her lap, and a marriage in the passenger seat that I did not think was going to survive the drive. We ate together at that table after they left, because Helen would have wanted people fed, and because a Sunday supper is a Sunday supper, and because the family that had gathered in her house that evening, my son, my daughter-in-law, my granddaughter, my lawyer of 40 years, an accountant, an investigator, and a detective, was, for that one evening, the family I had. Emma sat in Helen's chair by the front window, with a plate on her lap. Mike sat next to me. Sarah told a story about a patient of hers that made Margaret laugh. Rita took her jacket off and put her feet up on my ottoman. Detective Hale ate 2 servings. I stood up at some point and I said, "I know this is a strange evening for a toast, but my Helen kept every one of us at this table, whether we knew it or not, and I would like to raise a glass to her and to the letter she wrote us all a year ago in her handwriting, and in her patience and in her not giving up on any of us. To Helen." And every glass in that room went up. The next morning at 8 a.m., Margaret sent the notices out. Every single one, in one clean wave. Trevor was served the revocation and the restitution schedule, and Kevin Ross's practice was served notice of the complaint that had been filed with the Bar Association. Nina Pratt was served the notice that any listing she had for my property was fraudulent and had been from day one, and any attempt to shop it or record it going forward would be prosecuted, and the notice went to her broker of record too. Willowbrook Senior Living was served notice with a copy of Rita's report, so that the record at that facility would forever after show that a deposit had been placed there in bad faith, on a father whose family was attempting to strip him of his freedom, and any future attempt to move me there against my will would land in a very specific file at the front desk. The accounts were locked, the doors were closed. It happened in about 90 minutes, in one clean pass, and by lunchtime, the whole legal structure Trevor had built to reach into my life was gone. Trevor made restitution. He did it because he saw, in one long look at Margaret's schedule and Detective Hale's file, that not making restitution was going to end his life in a specific and very legal way. And Trevor is nothing if not attentive to his own skin. He sold a house he owned. He sold his truck. He sold a boat. He liquidated what was left of his business, which was less than he had made himself believe, because Neil had told me privately that most of the paper Trevor floated on was air. Every dollar came back to me across the following 6 months, dollar by dollar, on a schedule Detective Hale and Margaret enforced. Detective Hale, given that outcome, did not file charges. That was his decision, not mine, and I did not lobby him one way or the other. Kevin Ross had a bar hearing that did not go well for him. Nina Pratt lost her real estate license in a small, quiet proceeding that made 2 lines in a professional newsletter. And the Wednesday after the funeral movers, when the mover company's owner called Rita to apologize about having been misled and refunded the deposit and gave a full statement, wound up on the right side of that file too. Everything got put back in place, plank by plank, exactly the way I had cut it. Rebecca's marriage did not survive the year. She left Trevor about 4 months after that Sunday supper, and she did it in a way that was as quiet as her plan had been noisy. She simply moved out. She rented a small apartment on the far side of town. She got a job at the library where her mother had worked for 38 years. The head librarian there is an old friend of Helen's, and she gave Rebecca a job on the reference desk without asking me a single question about it, though she asked Helen 1,000 times across a wall she could not open. And Rebecca began, at 43 years old, to try to build a life she could look her mother in the eye about, if she had gotten to look her mother in the eye about anything again. She has been trying, and she has not been fast, and she has not always been graceful about it, and I have been careful not to overpromise how much I have been able to hand her back. We see each other every couple of months. We do not talk about the plan, and we do not have to, because Helen's letter did the talking that needed to be done, and the letter is sitting on Rebecca's dresser and does its work every morning she gets up. Emma and Rebecca have started cautiously to know each other. Emma has more of her grandmother's forgiveness in her than I do, and I have been careful not to weigh Emma's kindness down with any of my own reservation. Rebecca has not asked me for $1 or a signature or a key, and I do not expect her to. That door is shut, and it will remain shut, and Rebecca knows it, and Rebecca, this is the part I am most surprised by and most grateful for, has not tried to pry it. She has so far respected the shape of the thing her mother's letter told her to respect. It has been 2 years now. I do not know if it will hold across a decade, but it has held so far, and that is more than I dared to hope for on the Sunday she walked out of my kitchen with her mother's letter in her hand. I sat down with Margaret after all of that had settled, and we arranged the estate the way it should have been arranged from the start, in the plain daylight, with Mike beside me. Margaret read every line aloud. I signed at every place I was supposed to sign, and every piece of it went into the same file the trust had lived in for 40 years. Rebecca is provided for in a small, careful way that is between her and me and does not appear in any story. The house, Helen's and mine, the trust, will go to Emma, held by Mike until she is old enough, with the workshop and the tools and the workbench going to her from the day she is old enough to want them, which appears to be already. Mike will have a piece to raise his family with. There is a small provision for Sarah on her own, and I insisted on it, because Sarah has been carrying this family longer than any of us. And the deed, that same paper Helen had asked me to keep only in my name for 40 years, will pass, when I am done with it, into the trust for Emma. My name will come off, and it will not go on to Rebecca's or Trevor's. It will go, one clean pass, from me to my granddaughter, and Helen's 40-year promise will be kept all the way to the last carpenter in the family who still knows how to make a joint that holds. And with the money that came back to me, and with a piece of what I had that I did not need at my age, I set up a foundation, and I named it for my wife, the Helen Whitaker Fund. Because I learned, going through this, how common the little maneuver Trevor pulled turned out to be. He was not clever. He was not original. He was doing a thing that gets done to more old people every single year in this country than the sound of it would let you believe. A medical POA that isn't a medical POA. A quiet listing by a family real estate agent on the house of an elder who never authorized it. A Wednesday after the funeral moving appointment booked 6 weeks before the funeral. It happens everywhere. It happens in nice houses and plain ones. It happens to sharp people and to gentle ones. Because it does not prey on stupidity. It preys on grief. It preys on the 8 months a family goes through when somebody is dying, and on the softest hour in an old man's life, and on the fact that grief makes a person willing to sign a piece of paper without reading it just to make the room stop being about the dying for 1 minute. That is what makes it so effective and so cruel. It turns the deepest kindness a person is carrying into the exact tool that gets used against them. The Helen Whitaker Fund does one thing, and it does it with a stubbornness Helen would have recognized. It pays for the lawyers and forensic accountants and investigators an old person needs when a family member has begun to build the kind of thing Rebecca and Trevor built. Because most of the people this happens to cannot afford Margaret Chen. They cannot afford Neil Corrigan. They cannot afford Rita Lawson. And without those three, and without a good local detective like Marcus Hale on the other end of the phone, an old person up against a plan like Rebecca's does not, most of the time, come out with a house. So, the fund pays for those people, and it fights those cases, and it teaches Helen's rule, the one she made me promise 40 years ago at a kitchen table in a rented apartment. To anyone who will listen. Keep your name on the papers. Do not let a soft voice at the wrong hour talk you into signing something you haven't read. If a family member brings a paper for you to sign in a hospital corridor, put the paper in your pocket and take it to a lawyer of your own, picking on a day when nobody is dying, and read every word of it out loud, and only then decide. That's the rule. That's the whole rule. It's the rule my Helen wrote across the top of my life 40 years ago. And every year that goes by, the fund shows me another 20 old people who found out, the hard way. What happens when a family doesn't have that rule? Let me tell you about one woman, because a story about one is truer than a story about 100. Her name was Ruth. That isn't her real name, but Ruth is what her people called her. And Ruth was 78, and her son-in-law had done to her almost exactly what Trevor had done to me. A medical POA signed on a bad night. A quiet listing of the house through a realtor cousin. A booked mover 6 weeks in advance for the week after Ruth's husband was expected to die. Ruth's husband died on a Sunday. Ruth's daughter handed her a folder with a real estate offer in it on the Tuesday of the funeral. Ruth was 78 years old and had been married 59 years and was so hollowed out she could not remember the day of the week, and she almost signed. She almost signed. A young woman at the funeral home, a young woman we do not know the name of, who happened to overhear the daughter talking with the son-in-law in the parking lot about getting mom's signature today, we need it today. A young woman at the funeral home called Adult Protective Services from her car on her lunch break. And that call, made on somebody else's lunch break, saved Ruth's house. APS put the Helen Whitaker Fund in touch with Ruth 2 days later. Ruth had our Margaret equivalent in that county in her living room the following Sunday. Ruth did not sign. Ruth kept her home. And Ruth, when I met her a year later at a small dinner the fund holds for the people it has helped, walked up to me across a room full of people and put her hands on both sides of my face and said, "Ed, your Helen kept my house for me. Please tell her that from me. She kept my house." I said I would. I have. I tell my Helen every night when I sit in her chair by the front window with the light coming down through the trees, whose houses she kept that week and whose she is going to keep next. I have watched the fund grow across 3 years now. It is not a fortune. It does not need to be. It works in small, careful cases the way a good carpenter works in small, careful joints. One at a time, cut once, well, and it has done, in 3 years, more good than my Rebecca and my Trevor did harm. And that has been a piece of the healing of it, because the truth is that the money they took from me came back, plus interest. In the shape of every old widow's house the fund is held up under a bad wind. That is how you settle an account like that. Not by hating the person who owed it, by spending the amount it turned into a different pocket entirely. And in the end, I went back to the shop. That's the simplest part of it, and the best. I did not go back to putting up houses at 74. That time is over. But I have the basement workshop, and I have my hands, and above all now, I have Emma. Emma comes every Saturday, and most Sundays, and every afternoon of any school holiday she can get. She has become, over 3 years, a young carpenter I would be proud to have hired at any point in my working life. She is fast, and she is careful, and she has the patience for the work that most young people don't have, because we do not teach patience anymore. Emma waits. Emma reads the grain. Emma takes a shaving at a time. She has finished, so far, a small side table she gave to her mother for a birthday, a hand-cut jewelry box with dovetails that would have made my father proud, a bookshelf for her own room, and a set of nesting boxes she designed herself. Her father teaches shop at the high school, and she is already better than the seniors he teaches, and Mike tells me she runs circles around them without making them feel it, because Emma has, on top of everything else, her grandmother's grace. I have started to think of the workshop as Emma's shop already, though I still work in it every day, because that is what it will be when I am done with it, and because it is right for Emma to grow up thinking of that room as hers. I have been quietly moving my tools, one by one, from the shelf they have lived on for 40 years, to the shelves I am building on the other wall of the shop for Emma to use. It is a small thing, but she notices, and she smiles at it. And it is the kind of small thing that tells a young person she is being taken seriously without anybody having to sit her down and say it in words. Emma is being taken seriously. She knows it. She is coming up in this trade with the assumption that a room full of tools belongs to her, and I want that to be the assumption she carries into the world, because I did not have it at her age, and I remember what it took me to earn it. I have also, because Mike suggested it, and because Emma said yes, started teaching a small class down at Mike's high school on Thursday evenings. It's just a hand tool workshop for kids who want to learn what the power tools in the shop can't teach them. Planing, chiseling, hand-cutting joints, reading a piece of stock. I do it for free. Mike hosts. The school is glad to have the room used. 9 or 10 kids come. Emma has been an apprentice teacher of a kind. She demonstrates a lot of the joints because her hands are patient, and because kids listen to another kid at a bench in a way they will not listen to an old man. I stand at the back and watch her show a boy how to hold a plane, watch her walk a girl through a first mortise, and I think about my Helen and about a granddaughter I had never met 3 years ago, and about the shape of what a life ends up being when you finally do the thing you should have done 6 years back and pick up the phone and dial your son. I do not know a lot of things. I know that Thursday nights at that high school shop, teaching kids something that most of the world has stopped teaching, is one of the two best things in my week. The other being Saturday morning in the basement with Emma, and Sunday supper with Mike and Sarah, if we count those together, which I do. I also, once a month, take my kit to a place I would like to say very carefully to you now, because it is important. I go to the assisted living place across town from Willowbrook. Not to Willowbrook, though I have made peace with what Willowbrook is, and would go there if I were ever asked. I go to a smaller place where a friend of Sarah's works, and I bring a set of hand tools, and I run a small woodworking hour for the residents who are still able to hold a plane. It is the same idea as Emma's high school shop, but at the other end of a life. I stand at a folding table with 3 or 4 old men and one very sharp old woman named Louise, and we take shavings off pieces of pine, and we talk, and we listen to whatever anyone has to say about anything. And once an hour is up, I pack the kit back into the truck and drive home. I do it because I remember what it felt like, in the 8 months my Helen was dying, to be around people who looked at me and saw only somebody to be managed. I remember what it felt like at the reception in my living room, watching Rebecca move through my kitchen like I was already gone. And I remember what it felt like to be looked at by Emma on my porch on a Wednesday morning, like I was a whole person again. There is not much difference, I have come to think, between the old people at that folding table and me, except an accident of health and the presence in my life of a granddaughter who wanted a plane put in her hand. And so I go and I bring the planes, and I let those old folks be somebody with a piece of pine in their hand for an hour, because being somebody with a piece of pine in your hand is one of the small things that is worth being at any age. Louise, the sharp old woman, said something to me the 3rd or 4th time I came that has stayed with me. She said, "You know what I like about this, Ed? Nobody in this building has looked at me like I could do anything since I got here. You come in with a plane and you hand it to me and you say, 'Read the grain.' Nobody's told me to read anything in 6 months. I forgot what it felt like. I said, 'Louise, you're going to read the grain, and you're going to take a shaving off this piece of pine, and it's going to come off translucent, and you're going to feel like a person again. That's the whole trick.'" And Louise laughed, at 84, in a facility she did not want to be in, and took a real shaving off a piece of pine, and looked at me across the table and said, "There, I'm a person again." That is why I go. It is the smallest work I have ever done, and it is some of the truest. Let me tell you about a Sunday supper this past year, because it is the answer to that other Sunday, the one where Rebecca and Trevor drove home with Helen's letter, and I stood at my front door and watched them go. It was a supper at my house. Mike and Sarah and Emma, of course. Margaret came because Margaret has become a friend in the way that a lawyer of 40 years becomes a friend after you have both buried a woman you loved. My cousin Mary came. Sarah's father, a retired welder, came. And, this part I want you to know, I do not say lightly, Rebecca came. Not with Trevor, there is no Trevor anymore. Just Rebecca, in a plain dress, without any of the manner she used to wear like a coat, carrying a bakery pie. She sat in the seat she has always sat in, and she was quiet. And Emma sat next to her, and Emma passed her the salad without hesitation. And my daughter and my granddaughter, separated by everything that had happened, passed a salad bowl back and forth at my kitchen table like people who were finding a way. Rebecca does not sit in Helen's chair. That chair stays empty. That is where I have chosen to leave it, and Rebecca has agreed. But Rebecca sits at the table, and she comes maybe once a month, and she has not tried to speak in her mother's name for anything since the letter. And she has not asked anything of me that could not be asked without asking. And it is possible, I do not want to overstate this, that Helen's letter did some of what Helen wrote it to do. I have looked at that empty chair a great deal over these 3 years, and I want to tell you honestly what I feel when I look at it, because it is not just grief and it is not just Helen, it is also Rebecca in a small, quiet way. Because the empty chair at my Sunday table is not only a widower's chair, it is also the chair Rebecca is not sitting in when she comes over. And it is a piece of what her mother told her in that letter. The piece that said, "Sweetheart, forgive yourself, but do not sit in my chair. Rebecca has not tried. She comes, she takes a seat at the far side of the table, she eats. She is grateful, and she leaves. And I forgive her, and I do not trust her, and I love her, and I do not sign anything she is anywhere near. And those three things sit together in me in a way I did not think they could sit together 3 years ago." I have thought a great deal about forgiveness and trust since Helen's letter, because the letter made me think about it. Because Helen wrote to Rebecca and to Mike and to me in the same voice. The voice of a woman laying down the weight of the things she had carried in her life for us, and asking each of us to lay down what we could. And what I have decided 3 years in is this: forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and pretending they are is what allows most of these plans to keep going in most families, most of the time. Forgiveness is what you give somebody to set yourself free. Trust is a paper the other person has to earn back, one signature at a time, over years, in small daylight transactions. And there is no shortcut. My daughter has my forgiveness. She does not have my trust. She may earn it back in pieces over decades, and if she does, I will hand her the pieces one at a time in the ordinary way. And if she doesn't, I will love her anyway. Both those things can be true. It has cost me some peace to hold them together. It has also cost me nothing at all compared to what it would have cost to try to pick one and pretend the other one wasn't there. And there is a thing about that empty chair I want to say for Emma, because someday she will hear this story, and she deserves to hear it clean. Rebecca is her aunt. She will always be her aunt. And I have never once since that Sunday said a word to Emma to turn her against her aunt. I told Emma the truth of what Rebecca and Trevor had done, in the plain, age-appropriate way when Emma had asked the questions herself, and I have left Emma free to make of Rebecca whatever her own heart makes of her. Emma has been more gracious with Rebecca than I have been able to be. She has, in fact, taken Rebecca out for coffee twice in the last year on her own initiative, and Rebecca called me the day after each of those coffees to say thank you, in a voice that carried something in it I had not heard in her voice in a very long time. That is Emma's doing, not mine. And it is Helen's doing, further back than Emma's. And it is another piece of the letter working its way through us, one relationship at a time. I think a lot about fathers and children, sitting at that table looking at that empty chair. For 6 years I ached because I had let a small, stupid fight with Mike calcify into a 6-year canyon, and I warmed myself instead at the daughter and son-in-law who kept coming around. And I got it exactly backwards. The child I had let drift was the one who came home to my front door with a plain dark jacket and a duffel bag and a 15-year-old girl on the morning after his mother's funeral because he loved his father enough to cross a 6-year canyon on the day his father needed him to. The child who kept coming around was building a plan to take her father's house. It is not the child who is close who loves you the most. It is the child who would treat what you love the way you treated it. I learned that too late by 6 years. And I carry the 6 years as a small scar I look at most mornings. But too late by 6 is not too late by forever. Mike is home, Emma is at the workbench, Sarah is in my kitchen, Rebecca is finding her way. Helen is in every room of the house she made me keep. That is what a life looks like when a promise gets kept for 40 years. That is what a life looks like when a letter written 11 months ahead of time finds its way into the right hands on the right Sunday. That is what a life looks like when a carpenter reads the grain. So, let me tell you what this whole thing taught me, from the seat of an old carpenter who thought he had learned everything a man needed to know, standing behind a workbench for 50 years, and found himself, at 74, back at school with grief and betrayal for teachers. I learned that the loudest thing in the room is almost never the piece that is holding it up. My daughter was warm and busy and confident and full of her plan, and she filled every family dinner and every phone call and every hospital corridor with the sureness that she was the one taking care of things, and she had nothing. I was quiet and slow and dozing in my chair in the afternoons and seemed to have nothing, and I had everything, because a small, stubborn librarian at a kitchen table 40 years ago had made me keep my name on the papers. Do not let the noise fool you. Look at whose name is on the paper. Always look at whose name is on the paper. I learned that being underestimated is a kind of power, if you have the patience to use it instead of the pride to waste it. My whole life, being underestimated used to make me angry. The fellows who thought a carpenter was a simple man, the bankers who talked down to me at closings, the son-in-law who decided his father-in-law was a widower in a chair. And in this, for the first time, I stopped fighting it and started using it. I let Rebecca think I was slower than I was. I let Trevor think a bottle of bourbon on my kitchen table would soften me. I sat through 3 weeks of casseroles and soft managing voices, and I let them lay every brick of their plan while they thought I was helpfully falling asleep to it. Because a man they have written off can move freely. Nobody watches a ghost. Every day they underestimated me was a day I got more done. So if you are old and you can feel the world starting to write you off, I know how it burns. I do. I have felt it. But there is a gift hidden in it if you are patient enough to dig it out. Let them think what they think. Do your quiet work underneath. And be there, wide awake and clear-eyed, on the day they finally look up and realize the old man they wrote off has been holding the drawing the whole time. Do not let the noise fool you. Look at whose name is on the paper. Always look at whose name is on the paper. I learned that patience is not weakness, even though it wears the same coat. And that is exactly why impatient people mistake it for weakness and hurt themselves, throwing themselves against it. I spent 3 weeks after Helen's funeral playing a softening old widower, while Neil and Rita and Margaret laid the whole picture out on Margaret's desk. Not because I was weak, because you do not cut a piece of wood before you have read the grain, and you do not put a fastener into a joint before you have the drawing, and you do not answer a plan by shouting at the person who built it. You answer a plan with a better drawing, and a better drawing takes time. They thought I was slow because I could not be quick. I was slow because slow was the only way to do it right, and I had known that since a foreman put a plane in my hand at 15 years old and told me to read the grain before I cut. I learned that you reap what you sow, and it is not a saying, it is a law, as sure as the fact that wood remembers what you did to it. My daughter and her husband sowed 8 months of quiet lying, dressed up as helping. They didn't think anything would come up. It came up. It always comes up. You can plant a lie in secret, but you cannot keep it from growing, and you do not get to choose the day it comes ripe. And one Sunday, you're sitting at your father's kitchen table, listening to a detective and a lawyer and an accountant and an investigator. Each read one piece of the harvest you planted, and every piece fits every other piece, and there is nothing you can say. I did not do that to Rebecca. I just read the grain. She built the story. I brought the drawing. The drawing won because the drawing always wins, and any carpenter can tell you so. And I learned the difference between what a thing is worth and what a thing is. My daughter looked at the house I built with my hands and saw a comp on Trevor's spreadsheet. Trevor looked at the porch I made for my Helen and saw a tear down. They looked at 51 years of a marriage lived in these rooms, and they called it too big for one old man. And they spent their year counting what things were worth, and they ended with nothing, because a person who only counts what things are worth never owns anything that is actually worth anything. The things that count don't have a price. They have a name on a deed, and a granddaughter at a workbench, and a letter in Rebecca's dresser drawer, and a chair by the front window that stays empty in exactly the way it needs to stay empty. Those are the things. Trevor could not have priced any of them. Rebecca is learning to see them again, and I hope she does, because they are what her mother was trying to hand her from the other side of the letter, and they are the thing her mother left for her that she could still, if she chose, take up. You can hand your father a moving box the afternoon of his wife's funeral. You cannot hand yourself the deed, and you cannot rewrite the letter your mother left you. Helen wrote her letter first. Trevor drafted his POA second. Rebecca handed me her flattened box third. And when the 4 papers were finally read out loud, at one kitchen table, in front of the right people, only one paper held. And that paper was Helen's, and she had written it before any of the rest of us had put pen to a page. The rest was a plan built on the assumption that Helen would not have prepared. That is the assumption every plan like this is built on, in every family it happens in. Do not let the people around you make that assumption about you. Write the letter, set the trust, keep your name on the papers, and then, if the plan comes, the plan meets the paper you wrote first, and the plan does not stand. The frame held. The way a frame holds when it is built honest by hands that read the grain, through the hardest weather the family ever throws at it. Helen, you were right about all of it, about her, about him, about the children, about the kitchen table talk 40 years ago that saved me. I kept my name on the papers, my love, and I kept my promise to you, and it held everything, the house, and the study I built for you, and the porch, and the workbench, and the 15-year-old girl who was going to have all of it after me. and the sun, I finally got back to sit beside me on my own front step. You always could see the shape of a thing before it happened. And you wrote the letter to Rebecca a year before you needed to, and you carried it in Margaret's file with the patience of a librarian who trusts a book to reach the right hand at the right time. And it did. The letter reached her. It has been working on her since. It may not finish its work in what's left of my life, but it is working. And you did that from a year before you left. So, well done, my love. Well done. I will see you in a while. Keep the seat by the front window ready. I am still teaching Emma, and then I'll come. If you have come this far with me, and if there is an old person in your life, or if the old person is you, take one thing out of all of it. When somebody in your family shows up at the softest hour of your life with a plan already made, look at the plan hard, no matter how soft they say it. Most of the time, it is just love, thank God. And if that's what you find, get on your knees and be grateful, because that is the richest thing there is. But sometimes it is a flattened cardboard box that has been sitting on the back seat of your daughter's car for weeks. And the only way to tell the difference is to keep your eyes open and your name on the papers and your hand on every document before you sign it. Trust the people who beg you to read. Be careful of the ones who hand you a clipboard at 4 a.m. in a hospital corridor and tell you it's routine. It is the simplest thing I know. It saved my house, my son, my granddaughter, and, in the end, my wife's honor. And I learned it from a librarian who sat me down at a kitchen table in a rented apartment 40 years ago and made me promise, and I kept the promise, and the promise kept everything else. Thank you for staying to the end. If any of this rang true, then do the small, unglamorous things that actually hold. Find out today whose name is on your deed. Read every line before you sign it, no matter how sweetly somebody tells you it's nothing you need to trouble with. Keep the real papers where only you can reach them, and the key on your own keyring. Write your own letter, in your own handwriting, to the people who might one day need to hear your voice out of an envelope, and leave the letter with a lawyer of your own picking and trust that lawyer to hand it to the right person on the right day. Those are the fences, and they hold. Go check your papers, and if you can, go sit an hour with somebody old and alone. Not with anything to sign, just to sit. Because loneliness is the door that people like my son-in-law come through, and sometimes the only lock you need on that door is somebody who shows up for the right reason. And if you are the old one, and somebody in your family has shown you a version of a moving box lately, hear this from a man who woke up on a Tuesday to bury his wife and had a flattened box handed to him the same afternoon. You are not finished, not while your name's on the papers, not while your hands still know how to read a grain, not while there is one person left in the world who would rather sit an hour at your workbench than count the square footage of your lot. And if there is a chair at your table tonight, let the person in it be one of the ones who would water the roses your wife planted, not one who would put your porch in the dumpster. If you are lucky, they are the same person. If you are unlucky, they are two different people, and you get to choose which one you seat, and I am here to tell you, at 77 years old, choose the one at the workbench every time, even when the one with the spreadsheet is louder and has a bakery pie in her hand. My daughter handed me a moving box the afternoon we buried my wife. I handed her the deed to read out loud, and 3 weeks later, my wife handed her a letter she had written 11 months before, from the other side of the grave, that said, "I love you, Becca. Try harder. Choose better. Come back. Yours forever, Mama." And what a schoolteacher librarian wrote in her own handwriting a year before she died turned out to be the only paper in that whole room that could not be answered, and it was the paper that reached the person all the papers had been about. That is how a wife saves a family from beyond the grave. That is how a librarian saves a house 40 years after she reads a book. And that is what I have left at 77 years old. A granddaughter at a workbench, a son on my porch, a daughter finding her way, an empty chair I have made peace with, a wife in every room, and my name, still, on the papers. We buried her on a Tuesday. Sun came clean through the trees. The pastor said the words, and I let them fall, and I stood. My knees weren't mine, but my daughter's arm was there, until she was back at the house with a flat box under her arm, and no good. "Too big for one old man now," she said, and held it out to me in a voice she'd rehearsed for weeks, the softest voice she had. I did not argue. I went to the study of the house I made, to the desk I built for Helen when we were young, Took out the deed, handed it to my daughter, read it out loud, sweetheart, every word. She read, and she came at last to my name alone, held in trust since '84, when a librarian's father told a librarian a thing, and the librarian told a young carpenter, "Hold this fast, your name only, Ed. Trust me, trust the paper, it will hold in any weather." Rebecca stopped. Trevor's face changed. She said, "Daddy, And I said, "Go, take your flat box back to the car, honey. Come next week. Tonight is mine." And they went. I sat at the desk I planned by hand in 1972, alone, and I read on my daughter's face what a year of Helen's dying had been used to design. But Helen had prepared. A librarian prepares. She wrote to Margaret 11 months before her death, 3 letters, one for me, one for our son, and one for our girl, sealed them in envelopes, gave them into a file, and set in Margaret's hand the day and the way each would be delivered, one by one. 3 weeks later, at my kitchen table, with Michael and Sarah and Emma there, and Margaret and Rita and Neil, and a detective in a plain jacket by the door, Margaret slid the sealed envelope across the wood to my Becca. "Read it, dear, every word," your mother asked, and Becca read, and her voice broke, and more. "Try harder," my mother's letter said. "Choose better. Come back. Yours forever, Mama." And the whole plan Trevor and Becca had built for a year, the POA, the shell, the listing, the movers, Willowbrook, the softest hour of my life, the drama of a flattened box, the afternoon of a funeral, went quiet because Helen had held it, well, on paper before any of it began. The frame held, the way a frame holds when honest hands read the grain, the way a promise holds when a carpenter keeps it 40 years, the way a librarian holds a whole family in her patience and her writing, the modest, sturdy scaffolding of a woman who saw us all clearly and loved us anyway, without fears. I sit now in her chair by the window some evenings. Emma is at the workbench downstairs. Mike is on the porch, mending a step I taught him to mend when he was 7. Rebecca is at her mother's library, at the reference desk her mother worked, learning slowly, prayers I never knew I was praying quietly, answered a piece at a time, and Helen is in every room, even